Present.
Commissioner Matthews,
Present.
Commissioner Stacy,
Present.
Vice Chair Serrano,
Present.
and Chair Ibanez.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Ready,
Thank
buddy?
you.
You changed your mind.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Okay,
You want to build
we
some
will
stuff
now
together?
Yeah.
open the meeting up to public comments on matters not on the agenda.
And I can help with that?
Okay. Do we have one? Okay, we have two. Let's start with the first one. I don't have the names in front of me. Can I? Jasmine, you have 3 minutes. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, Jasmine, you have 3 minutes to speak at items, on comments on matters not on the agenda, and your
Okay.
time starts now. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, I'm driving. Excuse me, sis. I'm just calling to see if you guys can do something about the police calling Jamal Patterson's mother. I just left Miss Lisa's house right now, and she said that the Pasadena police haven't even called her and told her what's going on with her son's murder. He was just killed on Summit last week. She needs his body to be released, and so she can bury him. And no detective has called. Nobody has reached out to her. I actually reached out to Mayor Gordo today to see if he can have something done. So maybe you guys have like an inclination on what to do with that. That'd be awesome. That's really all I called to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Next public speaker is not checked in. Therefore, we are going to go ahead and proceed with the next agenda item, Chair.
So before we begin our agenda items, I would like for the community to know how we got here and how that history informs our purpose for this commission. So with that said, I am passing it over to Commissioner Anand, who will remind us of that journey.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And moreover, I'm talking to the commissioners, but I'm really talking to our community. But I also want to acknowledge Commissioner Argento, Judge, for your comment last week, because it actually really spurred the idea of this conversation today, which I'll make very brief, is none of us would be sitting here if it wasn't for the mobilization of our community. It wouldn't none of us would be sitting here if it wasn't for women who just, women and men, just like Jasmine, who just called in, and various organizations who spearheaded this. And let's go back. At the end of the day, the crux of this started in George Floyd. And we all rallied. For 20 years, we've been asking our city council to put an oversight commission. And we've also been asking for many transparent places. But George Floyd gave us that position, and we used it, and we leveraged it with the community to mobilize, stop city council for close to 3 hours with phone calls and letters to say that we wanted something more. We were given something, but we didn't accept it. And we didn't accept the deal that was given, and we asked for it to go back. And it did go back, but it was going to take a little bit longer. But as usual, things happen. And those things that happened actually was a life. Anthony McLean. And the week after, when council came in, they realized, Houston, we have a problem, and we're going to have to fix it, because the community has not only just spoken in 2 rallies that filled out City Hall grounds, and peaceful rallies, and spearheaded by Endelon and NAACP. I have to give credit for those 2 organizations, because deciding to move as Black and brown movements was critical and absolutely strategic to what then went forward. And so as we moved on, then the council did vote us in, and it has taken a year. But I want to acknowledge that this was not an electoral position that was taken. This was not council members that got together. This was not anything to do with city council unless because they were pushed over to the cliff and they were pushed by the mobilization of every single one of our districts that said that it was time for this space to be created. And I just thank you, Judge Argentino. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, because you made it absolutely crystal clear last week the importance of the community's voice. And though I sit in a community seat and others sit in a community seat, we all sit in a community seat. And so as we move forward, we need to remember, because history sometimes forgets how we got here. And it was not the electoral class, it was the community's voices and their mobilization. And they won't stop, and they will be intense, and they're looking for us to not just go with the status quo, but to move forward in solutions and not live in islands of complaints. So that's where we came from, and I give kudos to every community person that wrote in, every community person that called in, every community person that badgered their council member to get us where we are. And so the work can start beginning. Thank you so much, Chair Ibanez.
Thank you, Flo. Well, with that said, I think we can move forward onto the first agenda item.
Yeah, which can probably also there. Okay.
Eric, can you please announce just the agenda item so everyone listening in the public is aware of what we'll be talking about?
Yes, so first agenda item is the discussion of Commission's role and oversight authority related to officer-involved shootings and use of force incidents.
Okay, we're good? Okay. Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Are you not? All right. So again, good to see you all again this evening. Again, I'm Justin Sanders with my colleague Christine Diaz-Herrera. We're outside counsel to the commission. We understand that we received the questions that several of you had, and we want to address those directly. We anticipate that you have probably some follow-up questions that either we can answer or Javon Rad can answer as well. Some of what we'll talk about today we covered briefly in the first meeting a few weeks ago, but these are just a little more specific as to the two questions you asked. First, with regard to the commission's role in officer-involved shootings. The purpose of what we're trying to do today is help you all understand what you're allowed to do under the ordinances, and we can kind of go through those bullet points, and then you can ask some follow-up questions at the end if you have any. Okay, so first, and some of this obviously the language is being tracked from the ordinance. The commission can request that the independent police auditor, Mr. MAXEY, provide a report regarding the use of force issues overall. Okay, and when we talk about that, we're talking about aggregate data. All right, so that the commission can ask Mr. MAXEY to provide reports on that type of information. Second, the commission can invite the police department to come speak at these meetings and address police department concerns. One thing to keep in mind is that the police department is not necessarily obligated to attend or necessarily to follow whatever the commission's input might be, but the commission has the power to invite the police department to come and speak at these meetings and address concerns. Third, the commission can discuss police department policies and recommend changes to current police department policies. Now, here I'm listing a few things that the commission can't do. under the ordinances. So the commission can't investigate specific officer-involved shootings for the purpose of discipline, okay? Commission's not an investigatory body. Second, the commission can't directly or indirectly take an active participation in personnel matters related to the police department. That's not within the powers. Third, the commission cannot use the records developed to take personnel actions over anyone in the police department. So we're just clarifying that the commission does not have personnel power over the police department. And finally here, the commission cannot direct that action be taken on police department employees. Next, and just a few more in terms of what the commission can't do, and these are straight from the ordinance. The commission can't subpoena personnel records. I think that's probably for obvious reasons. And then next, the commission can't require the attendance or testimony at these meetings of City of Pasadena employees. And this includes the city's former employees. And here's just an important reminder and just a general consideration is that the commission is expected to comply with all of Pasadena's laws or all applicable laws that might overlap with some of the issues that the commission is dealing with. So that could be employment laws, personnel record laws, confidentiality laws, and importantly in here, the commission is expected to preserve the confidentiality of police department personnel records or any other files that come into your possession, okay? So any sensitive, confidential information that you obtain as commission members, you're expected to preserve that confidentiality to the maximum extent permitted by law. All right, your next question.
I think we'll pause there.
Okay, one pause. Okay.
We're gonna let it, yeah.
Okay. So it's
Stop the share. You can ask questions.
okay.
Chair, if you'd like to open it up for questions now, we can do that.
Yeah, I would like to open it up for questions from the commission. Yeah.
And Chair, if you would like to just help us call on people as they come in, we'd appreciate that help. Can you see?
I didn't see the hands.
Can you see the hands?
I can see them now. Commissioner Kanaga?
Thank you. Justin, I just wanted to make sure that I understand that the commission can discuss policies, right, and recommend changes to policies. But insofar as it cannot delve into personnel matters, it could, for example, or could it, for example, recommend changes with regards to hiring practices or outreach practices? Not, in other words, specifically zeroing on any particular candidate.
I can take that question. This is Christine Diaz-Herrera. I work with Justin here at Sanders Roberts. So the commission has the broad power to invite the police department to talk about their various policies and to discuss them, to give you more information about what they are. And as well, you also have the ability to discuss them within your group and to say, you know, looking at what you want to accomplish within the commission and what your goals are overall. If a policy change is part of your goals that you guys decide as a body, then certainly you can agendize that to talk about, look, you know, with, for example, there's, you know, an officer involved shooting. Well, you may not be focusing directly on that particular incident. You can look at the policies that you think may have been an issue that may have precipitated what happened or something of that nature. And you can certainly look at those policies, discuss them, and, you know, to the extent that you have recommendations, you're certainly empowered to give those recommendations. But, as Justin said, there, certainly are limitations in the sense that there is no obligation for them to enact your policy recommendations, but you certainly are empowered to discuss them and to recommend policy recommendations.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, consistent with what you just said, we would nevertheless be able to make, for example, recommendations that arguably would impact personnel, the word personnel, but it would not be, for example, talking about a particular candidate, which seems to me would be not be allowed.
And, yeah, Commissioner Kanaka, this is Javon Rad from City Attorney's Office. I think making recommendations, I think that where they could necessarily impact, I think if it's more of this commission is advisory to the department, so the police department can take those suggestions and give it the weight it deserves in its own process, whether it's looking for new officers or for promotional things. But if the commission wanted to make part of its work plan making recommendations, if we think certain positions should have this kind of skill set or this kind of experience or training, that's certainly within what the commission could have. But to say this person should be hired or this person, that's where it gets to be a problem. But in terms of general aspirations, absolutely, that's something the commission could take on.
All right, thank you for the clarification.
Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Chair Banez. My question is just to clarify in requesting documentation from our IPA. Is it a matter of like requesting or directing as a matter of obtaining reports of use of force and etc.?
Now, are you? I'm sorry.
I think Commissioner Jones. I think if I understand the question in terms of the auditor on his own by way of the code already has to look at all categorical uses of force, all bias complaints. So the auditor's in the process of getting access to doing that, and so Brian's already doing. He doesn't need to be requested, directed, or anything by the commission. The council has so spoken. It's in the ordinance. So as Brian gets sort of a core amount of uses of force to review and also bias complaints, I think he'll be reporting to the commission from time to time about his review of those. But that's something the commission doesn't need to do anything more other than just when Brian comes and presents his reports, then the commission can kind of react to those.
Okay. I understand from last week's conversation that he already has the first half of the year. So that would be like January to June, I suppose. Maybe, I don't know if you guys could even answer that, or if that would more be a question for Mr. MAXEY, but would he be presenting like half the year at a time? So we wouldn't necessarily have those details of the reports that he's compiling in real time. It'd be, like delayed. So whatever he's working on now is from the start of the year. What could we anticipate as to when we get access to those reports, or what his presentation timeframe would look like?
I think Brian might be able to answer when he may be coming with his sort of first batch of reviews, perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So my understanding is that within the first 6 months, there are 19 cases that fall into the categorical use of force. And if I'm remembering correctly, my numbers might be slightly off. I am still getting access to those systems. Once I have them, I can start reviewing those cases. My goal is to have initial report on the first 6 months by end of year to you. But it does depend on when I get access, and I was just informed that I should be having the cases come to me starting next week, so I can get to work on them. But that's my goal, and we'll see how it plays out in real time. Just also so you know, I'll be talking a little bit later tonight about some of the policy implications that might come from some of those reviews.
And so, Commissioner Jones, I think with Brian's timetable, if that sort of plays through, I think that may look like perhaps an agenda item for the Commission's January meeting.
Commissioner Lurvy?
Thank you. Last meeting in public comment, there were references made to 3 particular officers, and given the parameters that you described, I just would like a little assistance on how the commission, being responsive to the community, would treat those type of comments that come forward about specific personnel.
You mean, are you asking, you mean like the fact that their names were mentioned, or maybe a criticism, or what do you, can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think in the public comment reference, why were they still employed? Those type of comments came up at the last meeting, and I just want to know how the commission might address those type of comments.
I think, Commissioner Lurvy, I think depending on the specific incident, if these are incidents that are still pending, those would be obviously things that the department would be looking into. So there's not a whole lot the commission can really do without interfering with the officers' confidentiality in their personnel files. I think that's something that, in terms of as concerns might be raised by the public, I think staff can collect those and share those with the department. But for the commission, particularly for pending personnel matters, it's not a whole lot that the commission can sort of do to, quote, respond to the community. I mean, if the department's still looking into something, the department is going to need to conclude what it's doing. If what the department's looking into is something that might be subject to disclosure under transparency laws, like SB 1421, like an officer-involved shooting, like a use of force causing great bodily injury, all the documents, all the records the department would have looked at would ultimately be made public at some point down the road. So the commission can see that stuff, the public can see that stuff for the matters covered by the transparency laws, but it wouldn't be immediate. And I think Michelle's got something to add too.
I would just, Commissioner Lurvy, I think the additional part of your question is, how does the commission respond to members of the public who raise those types of questions? And I think the response is in line with what was presented in terms of our scope does not allow us as a body to get involved with personnel decisions or why someone is still working or why someone hasn't been disciplined in some respect. So your response to them is that is not our scope. That is something that is within the purview of the personnel rules and policies and procedures for the city. And ultimately the city manager is responsible for that. And so we as a commission can't directly or indirectly impact that with respect to a particular employee. Does that kind of help?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, as we just mentioned this meeting, it's important for the commission to hear the concerns of the community, but there will be things that are beyond our scope. And I just don't want the community members who raise those concerns to feel that they're being ignored. So it's good to keep clarifying what the scope is and what the commission can do and what's beyond scope. So that's why I bring up.
One other point, Commissioner Lurvy, I think that might help is with the auditor doing reviews of all categorical use of force and the department's review of those. One of the things that Brian can look at is whether when the department renders on those uses of force, are they being fair? Are they being impartial? Are they being unbiased? Were they being thorough? And so that kind of goes to the question of, Why is somebody still working here? They should be fired. They shouldn't. And so Brian would be able to opine, not necessarily officer by officer, name by name, but at least in a general sense, is the department being thorough, fair, unbiased, impartial in how it does these reviews of uses of force.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Serrano.
Thank you, Chair. My question is more in relation to access to information, and I'm curious to know whether or not the commissioners and our auditor will be notified when an officer-involved shooting occurs in our community.
There aren't any plans currently that we are aware of to do that.
If we were to desire as a body to make that request, in other words, to say that as the commission providing community-based oversight of the police department, that we would expect that the police department would notify us and that we wouldn't have to, open the morning news in order to access that information. How and to whom would we make that request known?
Well, you make it to your staff person, Amanda Fowler, who is here, and then she will get in touch with those who are appropriate to address it, which would include presumably the city manager's office and the police department in terms of how that should be handled, and then get back to you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Emmerich Ford.
Yes, so I had a follow-up question to Mr. Maxley's comment on the categorical uses of force. You mentioned that there were 19 that you were currently looking at for this first half of the year. I just want to understand if you're also looking at the processes by which the police department, how they're identifying what is a categorical use of force, and what that process is. Would we have access to that information to be able to look at it against other police departments, how it's been improved? If we wanted information like that, would it come through you, or would we go through Amanda Fowler? And is that already something that you're doing as part of your review?
So that's an excellent question. Yes. There's two things that are going to be happening simultaneously. One is a review of policies, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later tonight also to explore some of your priorities. And then in terms of the use of force reviews, and there's two things that are happening. One is I'm going to have access to all the files. I'm going to get the body-worn camera video, the direct police reports, the witness statements, everything that goes into that investigation. At the same time, I'm also going to be able to start attending the use of force reviews that happen within the police department, listening to command staff debate these cases, figure out what to do with them, and I'll have visibility into that. My understanding is I'm not to weigh in on those cases in real time, but I can certainly observe them and then report out on the process systemically later. So yes, ultimately I intend to use those cases to identify what's working, what's not working in those processes. At the same time, I will also be reviewing the policies and the processes themselves more in the abstract, as opposed to how they play out in practice, just to see if there are any gaps or better practices that could be brought to bear on it. So I think my answer generally is yes to your question.
And Chair, if I could just ask a follow-up question on that. So then the idea would be if there were 19 that were presented, and then we get a community complaint of a categorical use of force that comes to us, and it's not something that is part of your 19 or something that you're currently investigating, I guess that would be a question for you, Justin. Is that considered an investigation of the police? How would we identify if someone comes to the commission and brings some evidence of this complaint and it appears to match the categorical use of force, but it was not one of those 19? What is our role in that instance?
You want me to take that, Brian? I think. Well, I think I think it's inevitable, and it's going to be commonplace that individuals are going to complain to members of the commission about some sort of issue. Now, if, for example, in your example, a complaint comes into you, and it could or might be one of the 19 that Brian is looking into, my thought would be that you would pass that to Amanda Fowler, and I believe she would probably be the best person to reconcile whether or not it's the same complaint or different.
Okay, and so I guess if it were different, then the follow-up question to that would be, is that something then, would we leave it with Amanda because it's not one of those 19, it didn't get counted, and there's evidence there that it might have been? Because that all leads to policy change. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. If the police didn't identify something and it wasn't counted and it comes to us in this manner.
And Commissioner Emmerich Ford, I think in something like that, that's where Amanda can move that along to the police department, and then they can give it the appropriate treatment. I think this goes back to Michelle's point with Commissioner Lurvy, that the commission only has so much jurisdiction. So if something did sort of somehow got left out, it didn't make it to the department, or didn't sort of get worked up, and it was a categorical use of force. Well, the department needs to give it treatment at some point, but the problem is that may or may not be something even the commission could get feedback on, because it may or may not be subject to the transparency laws. So that at the end of the day, it's important the department get it, that they can give it the weight it deserves. But the problem is that the pitches statutes kind of prevent a feedback loop. But I think it's still reasonable for the department to push the auditor, Brian, to say, hey, if things are getting missed like that, what's a better way to really define, identify, and track categorical uses of force so they do get reviewed? That is something that the department's been doing for at least 10, 12 years now. All categorical uses of force get a review. If they don't wait for a personnel complaint to happen. So that's something the department's doing for a long time. There's state law that came in a year or two ago, SB 230, that requires departments to have a use of force policy. PPD's had one. They're doing reviews. So if something like this were caught up, that would be something where the commission could push Brian to say, hey, do you think the department's doing sort of best practices, or is there something better to do here?
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Commissioner Nov?
Sorry, thank you. He just answered it. Thank you.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Yeah, I have a couple of follow-up questions. They're really process. So because we are just at step one with regards to developing processes, internal processes, for example, Vice Chair Serrano brought up I think an important question about whether or not the commission is going to be informed on officer-involved shootings. What opportunity will we have as a commission to decide collectively? I mean, personally, I agree with that, but what vehicle will there be for us to, as a commission, dialogue and decide that that is something that we officially want to be able to request? The second, so it's a process question. The second process question goes back to the city attorney, Michelle, had suggested language that would describe to a member of the public our jurisdiction. And it seems to me that although certain circumstances may change the language somewhat, the language that the city attorney suggested is solid from a legal standpoint. And I wanted to know how and when we would be in a position of making official responses, of issuing formal responses. And that may be something that we were going to get to with agenda item 4. So there are 2 process questions.
Well, with your first question, I was already thinking that Amanda was going to start the process of finding out what would be required in order to have the commission informed if there is an officer-involved shooting. So I think that process is already in the works based on the question. But theoretically and technically, the commission could vote to ask staff to look at X. And sometimes there's general consensus, and so you don't need a motion. I kind of took that question as all the commissioners probably would want to have that information. So I'm asking Amanda to look into that because I don't have the answer right now of how that would work and if there are any limitations or restrictions, etc. And then the second process question, which was
formal responses.
Oh, formal responses. I think, yeah, it would be through Amanda. And just like there's an FAQ on the website that was put up today that kind of summarized some of the questions, the commission's website could be a place that you could direct people to see what your scope, your authority, your role, what's going on with you, where your agendas are, and frequently asked questions. So if the statement that I made, whatever my response was, that could be typed up and it could be in the next set of FAQs, for instance. So that could be a method by which the commission communicates with the public.
So may I make a suggestion again? I feel like we're a little bit on the learning curve here. That perhaps the chair could, as a question comes up, a la what Vice Chair was requesting, get us a sense of the pulse of the commission, just to make sure that there was no difference of opinion. I mean, I don't want to speak for the other commissioners, is what I'm saying. And I don't think it was controversial, but there may be controversial requests that come up from individual commissioners. I just want a vehicle by which maybe Chair Ibanez can just make sure that there's consensus. That's all.
And that's a good point. And you can get that either, as I said, through a vote, if there seems to be a potential question, or he could pose the question, is there a general consensus of this? And that was just one example, but going forward, you'll have others. So he can say, is there, are any of you opposed, or do you have any objection to what's being asked of staff? Recognizing that at some point you will have to prioritize what your requests are.
Right. Okay, thank you.
And I'll just say as a reminder, in terms of kind of the process flow for each agenda item, we typically use this section right now to ask questions, get clarifying questions. Then we'll go to public comment, so you can hear what the public has to say if they have any feedback, and then we'll reconvene to kind of lead into more of that discussion, and that might be a good time for you to make some of those motions and directing staff to make some of those research requests.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Chair Ibanez. I just wanted to kind of state for the record, it's been expressed in the community that people are very much aware that we don't have any power. I don't know how serious our commission will be taken. It seems like we're a buffer for some of the things that come to the city council. And I also want to state for the record that just based on the fact that different people have different levels of involvement in community, some of us are going to get more questions have more community encounters than others.
Commissioner Anand?
I want to ask the question because it keeps coming up, and Wendy says is a critical incident, right? What is it deemed as a critical incident? So there may be something that's a critical incident that comes up in the community. I'll just make it out. There's still a use of force, but it's not death, right? But it is a critical incident, but then it may not be deemed as that. So I want it to be, maybe one of y'all can explain what is your definition to a critical incident, that would the explanation of Commissioner Kinaga is saying of what we should know. So is it just death, or what is it?
So I think, this is Javon, I think, Commissioner Nong, I think that would be something that would be helpful to get some feedback from the commission, that if it weren't just an OIS, what were you looking for? And sort of how deep critical incident is really, it's colloquially used, it's used differently in some different statutes. But realistically, I think what would help is, in terms of if the commission were looking for more than just OIS incidents, I think it would help Amanda to sort of frame it so she can dialogue with the police department in terms of what problems might there be. Because I think the more incidents that the commission is looking for information on, that requires perhaps more dialogue. If it was just OISs, that might
say what OIS.
An officer involved. If it was just officer involved shootings, I think that might be a simpler conversation. So I think it's more just, it would help to get some feedback from the commission on how far you want to drill down.
Okay. And then my other question is probably piggybacking Commissioner Jones when she was saying that the 19 or whatever incidents that Mr. Maxey might be coming to review to us, but then if incidents happen like within his 19, and I want to give an example, that something happens next week or whatever, we do know about it, or we get to know about it, or some of us know about it, but obviously we're not convening until the first week of December again. But is there a place in that meeting, because it was something that happened in December, that it is not a part of his 19 review, that we would like to be able to hear about it in that next meeting? Like, do we have that place? Because, and I say this to go back to what Commissioner Jones says, is that purview to the community, we can't have things happen and then sit and wait for months to when we're supposed to hear a review, but that thing has happened. So is there going to be a space, or are you saying that we have to create that space within our meetings, that if something does critical happen, that we have a space to then switch and say, okay, we need to at least discuss this. I know we can't talk about personnel. I know we can't talk about ins and outs or whatever, but for the fact that we can acknowledge, Houston, we just had a problem, I think that is an important space for us, and also for the community to acknowledge that if something does go wrong and we're only meeting once a month, that we are meeting. And I know we can have special meetings, but even if that doesn't happen and we just meet, that we have this space that we can address and acknowledge that this thing happened, and we will get more information as it comes along. That's my question.
Commissioner Nong, I think there is perhaps a space to talk about things sort of generally from a community standpoint. And I'll give you an example. The community meeting I think it was last week with Councilmember Kennedy, the city manager, a few others, regarding recent community violence. There's pending criminal investigations happening, but they could still have a community meeting and talk about community issues. They're not talking about the specific incidents themselves at all, or what's going on with the criminal investigation, and what's going on. So there perhaps could be a space for the commission. I do think, though, with what Brian's looking at, for example, say 19 categorical uses of force, a good chunk of those are probably not subject to transparency laws. For example, if you have taser deployment and the suspect is not injured, other than they remove the probes, and the suspect is not injured, that's something that Brian would see. It's a personnel record, and that's something that he really couldn't talk to the commission too much about in great detail about who the officer was or something like that. So I think they're getting into things that are sort of, let's talk about the incident itself, which perhaps even could be, like you said, Commissioner Knott, may have just happened, might be the subject of a criminal investigation. If it's categorical use of force, the department has 1 year to decide whether the officer should be disciplined or not. So if it just happened, it may be likely the department has not rendered on that use of force. So the problem is that the commission has a space to talk about more community-based things, but to talk about the incidents itself, I think that's a problem. But again, I think you've got a good benchmark just even last week with the council members doing a community meeting. That's something, that style or type of agenda item is something the commission could certainly take on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, commissioners, for your comments and questions. Does any commissioner have any other comments or questions before we open the public comments on this agenda item?
Everyone.
Okay, then we will move forward on public comments on this agenda item.
We do not have any public comments on this agenda item. So Chair, if you would like to bring it back for any further conversation and potential action staff can take, I think we do have some general feedback, but if you would like to formalize anything, we'd be happy to hear your feedback.
Yes, I don't know what the right phrasing for this would be, but I would like to open up the, I would like to check in if there's a general consensus as to what Vice Chair Serrano mentioned in regards to us formally requesting information from the department in relation to officer-involved shootings. Is anyone opposed?
Perfect, thank you. We'll take that as direction to look into that, and we'll report back on how we can make sure the commission has current information on any critical incidents.
Commissioner Emmerich Ford?
I'm not opposed to receiving the information. I think it would be important for us to receive, but I also think we need to take into consideration what information we ask for and what we can move on. And so I think it was Commissioner Jones had mentioned there's an expectation of what this commission can do just generally. And I don't think it might fit thoughts that are in the community based on what Justin just shared with us tonight. So I just want to caution us all to be careful on what it is we're asking for, and knowing that we might not be able to do anything about it, right? And just not setting up expectations for ourselves and or the community.
Well, personally, I agree that we've been told what we can't do, but I do think that when a critical incident happens in the community, that us as, let me just say myself, would like to know about the critical incident as it happens, than be blindsided by a community member that says that asks that information. But on the flip side, when critical incidents do happen, Chief Perez and Deputy Chief Moody have been very very quick to let me know, and maybe other commissioners as well, that we've had a critical incident. They do not say to us any form of details. They don't, they don't say anything, investigatory. They just say that this happened at this time, and to be aware. And I think that's all I need to know as a commissioner. That part, and it has always been a great communication piece from the police. That I don't need to know the ins and outs. I just need to know something has happened. So as I start to receive texts from around the community, I understand what is happening, and able to address it back. So I also know that we don't have no power to when something goes wrong, but to know, I think, is important for myself. That's just for myself. I don't need the ins and outs.
I'm gonna jump in and say that I agree with Commissioner Anay because of again, those differences. Some of the commissioners are not going to have community members walk up to them and ask them what's going on, what happened. And I do believe that enough people understand that in our role as commissioners, there's not a lot that we can do, but that doesn't mean that we can't be available to them in some capacity. If it's for them to vent or figure out how to pass along the complaint, like we have that authority to help them pass along the complaint and direct that to where it needs to go via Amanda Fowler. However, of the 11 of us, there's probably less than half of us that community members will walk up with their concerns or have questions. I'm someone who would receive text messages or phone calls when there's an incident, just based off of where I live. The shootings last week, some of those were within earshot. So I've got neighbors that text, hey, do you hear that? No, those weren't officer-involved incident. I'm not saying that, but there's some communication that happens with certain ones of us that's not going to happen with every one of us. So very much, I agree with Florence. If we can be notified when incidents do occur. So even with that, once we're gathering via Zoom for our meetings, half of us would know what happened and half of us wouldn't, based on our levels of community engagement or who are the direct surroundings. It'd be good for us to all know, hey, this happened in this area on this day. That's probably going to be something we're talking about at some point, even if it's down the line months later when Brian MAXEY is presenting his next set of reports. I agree with Florence.
Commissioner Abernathy?
Commissioner Emmert Ford, I do understand your caution, but I also think, as Commissioner Anand and Commissioner Jones have so clearly stated, this is vital, and this is a way in which we all have the information, at least related to that, and that really allows us to more fully, I would argue, do our job and have even being reflecting on it and being prepared to think about what that might mean. And it also is a way of hearing, collecting, if you will, the community concerns and being aware of that and having that inform what we do. One of the things I do understand with investigations, these things take time, but I think we're aware that one of the concerns for the community and many of us is just how long these processes take. So when you think about policies and procedures, I really do hope that will be something we look at. Again, some time has to be involved for how complicated it is, but these time periods are so long that it's really particularly challenging. So I fully support, I just want to add back to the original motion that you placed out there, Chair Ibanez. I just wanted to even emphasize that this is a request and it's vital to our job, just to, put a little more emphasis on it.
Thank you. Commissioner Argento?
Yes, Commissioner Abernathy said better than I would have said what I wanted to say. So I will ditto her comments and just add one, and that is I would hope that we could somehow develop a forum without violating the Brown Act in some way, where those of you who do get more comments would somehow inform us who may not be so likely to get those comments from people in the community, because that would give us some vicarious experience of your experience, and then we would know more about what's going on by virtue of having heard about conversations you all have.
And I absolutely agree with you. I think that for us to be cohesive and to even start to grow together, you know, city people, you know, you're not on mute, right? I just wanted to let you know that.
We can hear every whisper. Every whisper.
I'm just saying. But Judge, I think that I think for us to grow together, understand each other, and to even the bottom line, trust one another, right? And trust our gut instincts on one another is to have that form of communication. And I think that we just have to figure out how we get around it without breaking, you know, the Brown Act. But we have to communicate. Just before we had our meetings, you know, it was good to have breakfast and lunches with some people who reached out to myself. Let me just say myself. And I think that, you know, breaks the barriers and divide. But I think the more that we can communicate offline and get to know one another, even though this is hard for Zoom, even when we're in a room, I think that's really important. We just going to, I mean, I have the same thing with my Metro PSAC group. The Brown Act is all over it. There's 22 members. So, but we have to figure out how to communicate and get to one another. So I echo your point that there will come a time where it won't be about we don't know each other. We'll be able to trust each other's gut instinct. If Commissioner Abernathy said something and I know where she's coming from, I'm already going to be like, I already know where she's going. Yes, I'm in tune with that. If I know Commissioner Matthews says something and I'll be like, other people, I don't get where he's going. And even the community can say, I don't even get what was that commissioner was saying. But if I have a gut instinct about that commissioner, I'll be like, no, this is where they really try to come from. And they try to say this, and this. Oh, okay, I get it. That's what needs to happen in our different spaces, right? So that Black, brown, white, Asian, all the different cultures that we have here can start to merge. So I totally agree and I respect those things, but they're going to come in time. Thank you for muting, City. Blessings.
Thank you. Sorry, we were just trying to huddle on how we could help encourage such conversation, but we will be careful to mute. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you, commissioners. And staff, that's actually the question I was about to allude to. What are your thoughts on how to create forums without violating protocol?
Well, certainly one of the thoughts we had was you could give that information to Amanda and then she could perhaps send something to the group in terms of that information, or I don't know.
Yeah, and I think for Commissioner Argento, I think it's a good point, and I also think that obviously before you have 11 on the commission, it takes a little bit to get to 6, and so one of the things for the commission to think about is if there were issues that might need to be tackled. One way bodies do that is they appoint ad hoc committees, and so we talked about that a little bit with the Brown Act training last week, and that's something where not the commission but the chair could appoint, say, 2-3 members to an ad hoc committee on something, that might be of interest, and they could take a look at it. It's not like it's a group. An ad hoc committee is not a group that sort of has continuing jurisdiction over something. But if there were an interesting issue that a couple of members of the commission wanted to tackle, that the chair could appoint an ad hoc committee to take a look at it. I do think, though, that for all the commissioners to get to know all of each other, but talking about commission business, the only place to do that is at a commission meeting, because you're all individually commissioners, but you're not a commission unless you post an agenda and meet, whether at a regular meeting or a special meeting. And so I think that's something that the Brown Act does, prevent some of the getting together. But I do think what's important is the Brown Act allows the public to see the people's business. And that's why this meeting is still, it's on Zoom, but it's open to the public. And that's, you want to make sure that the commission's business is done publicly to the extent you can.
Actually, I have a question though. On when you just said the public is here, where is the chat facility for us to see what the community is putting in chat? Like I know even in the Brown Act for our other committees and commissions, is that we can have a chat facility, but we're able to, if we have the chat facility, we as commissioners, every time we want to put something in chat, we have to make sure that we put it to everybody, right? But
so I think
this, can I finish? But on this Zoom, I don't see where, if the public are chatting, where they're chatting, and how are we able to chat as well? Because we can in a special meeting, we can in a meeting that has an agenda.
So what you have here is you've got a meeting, it's a remote meeting. I believe the chat function is not enabled for this meeting, but for the public, two ways they can communicate with the body, or they can submit correspondence. And that link is on the agenda, and then separately, they can do public comment on the agenda items. Yeah, but I just fully respond to your question. The opening up the chat feature presents another sort of forum to contend with, and so for Brown Act concerns, it's a little easier for staff to be able to contend with correspondence that comes in, and then separately with public comment. Now, what I would say is that if the commission as a whole were really interested in the chat feature, I think that's something you could ask Amanda to take a look at and see if there might be a way to do it in a way that doesn't present some Brown Act concerns. But I think this is a little bit easier for staff to kind of contend with, and also avoids some Brown Act issues.
And I respectfully hear that it's hard for the staff to do this, but this whole process is going to be hard on both sides. And this whole process is going to be uncomfortable for both sides. And I know that in other committees and in Metro PSAC thing, the chat is totally open to the community, and all of us in the committee can be in the chat. Yes, it's difficult because it's another IT level. I get that. But because of this commission, that IT level and transparency, we have to begin somewhere. And we can't keep closing off the community to where they need to be able to at least be able to, get into spaces with us. And, and it's not going to be a negative space, but it is another level of IT. And I recognize that. And I would hopefully ask our chair and vice chair to consider that space, and other commissioners, because in 2021 the chat is where community have a space, especially in this zone. And I know it's uncomfortable to all you all, but it would set you guys free. Thank you.
Commissioner Jones.
This is, thank you, Chair Ibanez. This is backtracking to something Flo said earlier about just the commissioners being able to and Judge Argento or Commissioner Argento, for us to be able to get to know each other as people. Are we able to have some kind of breakfast or lunch together that's not a commission meeting and just be people, like ever, or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So all it is about talking about commission business. So, if all 11 of you run into each other at Ralph's, as long as you say, how about UCLA, that's fine. If you talk about commission business, that's the problem.
Okay. Because the way you guys, during the training, the 30 hours, the way the Brown Act was brought up was almost like we couldn't breathe in the same space as each other. I don't want to talk about commission business all the time, you know what I mean? And I'm sure that for the most part, the rest of us don't either. I value people as people. Sorry, my daughter's doing homework and she just finished her math. That's what that boom was. However, my point was only that, like, we're still just people, and the way you're forcing the Brown Act down our throat makes us feel like we can't just be people and get to learn each other, not on a political level, just on this human existence. Thank you for answering that, Javon.
Commissioner Stacy?
Excuse me, I just want to weigh in on the chat discussion that we had. I find it difficult to concentrate on what people in the meeting are saying if I'm trying to look at chat and read those things. If we were in an in-person meeting, all we would be hearing would be the commissioner speaking and the public speaking at appropriate times on our agenda. And that's how this Zoom meeting is being conducted, and I would personally find that chat would be very, very distracting. Thank you.
Commissioner Anand?
Yeah, I totally respect Commissioner Stacy's viewpoint, but after 2 years of COVID and after years of Zoom, where we're seeing each other, just through a camera, everybody has learned to multitask in the chat room to the thing, and also even having because we have Miss Amanda, Miss Fowler, she is the person who can monitor the chat room. That is not for if a commissioner is not bothered with the chat room, you're not bothered with it. But then Miss Fowler is the one that can see in the chat room for anything that comes about, and those commissioners that can want to multitask can be able to do that multitask. So I respect your views in Zoom technology, but that's kind of where most people are in the Zoom world. And then not so much even for our comfortability, I think it's a space for the community to be able to make points, good, bad, or indifferent. We listened to community members last week that weren't happy, and we're not going to hear community members that are going to say kumbaya. We're going to hear stuff that we cannot take offense to, but because it's their frustration, right? And sometimes their frustration might be in how people want to type out in the chat room, or wherever, to make it their ease. But it's not our comfortability that's about this. It's about also creating a space for the community to engage. So I respectfully, Commissioner Stacy, kind of push back on that. But I understand it's individual, each to our own.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody's input on this matter. I think it's very important that we take into account issues of accessibility, especially with community members that are differently abled. I know that especially through a virtual platform, we can't access everybody or reach everybody, but I think we can definitely make a big effort to be as accessible as we can to the community. So with that said, I would like to present an action item to formally request public chat integration into the virtual space. Are there any commissioners that are in opposition of this? Commissioner Stacy?
I just see it as a back room thing that is not available in a public meeting. So that's my stand, and I understand other commissioners may not feel that way. Thank you.
Chair Banyas, if you would like to move forward, maybe we can do a formal motion to see if you can get a second, and then we can do an actual roll call, since it seems like there might be not official clarity or just from a direction.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you for that help. Yeah, I'd like to motion formally requesting public chat integration into the virtual meetings.
I second.
That was second by Commissioner Kanaga.
Yes, that's right. I apologize. I did not raise my hand.
Do I now call a vote?
At your request, I can call the roll.
Oh, yes. Can you?
Yes. This is a motion moved by Chair Banyas, seconded by Commissioner Kanaga. Commissioner Abernathy?
Yes.
Commissioner Anand?
Yes.
Commissioner Argento?
Yes.
Commissioner Emmert Ford?
Yes.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Yes.
Commissioner Lurvy?
Yes.
Commissioner Matthews?
I'd like to ask a question before I vote. I'm not that familiar with the chat room and the accessibility and what's involved, so I'd like to abstain from this vote.
Absolutely. Commissioner Stacy?
No.
Vice Chair Serrano?
Yes.
Chair Banyas?
Yes.
That is 9 in favor, 1 against, and 1 abstain. The motion passes.
Commissioner Abernathy?
Thank you, Chair Banyas. Partly based on what Commissioner Matthews just said, but also other concerns, could it help that, like, we make some agreement about, how we want to make use of it or something, or even assist those of us who are less familiar with it, so that we, given what we just heard, that we respond to that desire if a person wants to be more involved with it. But I also think it could be, not that I have anything in mind, but just, okay, how do we want to ideally make use of chat ourselves as a commission? We all may do what we do, but I just wondered about that.
Commissioner Abernathy, one point I wanted to make, I was kind of understanding the chat feature to somewhat follow the dialogue of a little more information and access pertaining to officer-involved shootings, and then also just as it somewhat relates to the agenda item in terms of how to better communicate with the community. But if the commission really wanted to take up the idea of chat functions and what to do more than just the request to staff here, I think you probably would be better served by just agendizing it at the next meeting so the public knows the commission's discussing that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Emmert Ford?
So just a question on that. So then if we agendize this, then the idea would be how that could be used, formally used in a meeting, since it is a public comment, would be discussed to understand, since there's only a certain amount of time available for public comment period after each agenda item. So you would speak on that at the next meeting if we agendize it.
I think that's what Amanda can come back with. I think Michelle, before she left, was, I think, understanding the request of officer-involved shootings only, and I think with the commission wanting, and then with the, I think the way it came to, I think it was just sort of critical incidents, sort of colloquially speaking, and so Amanda's looking into that, and then separately as to the chat functions, I think that's something that I think Amanda, I think, was already going to be looking into, and with the commission's motion, I think that gives some focus to what staff can look into.
Perfect, thank you.
Shall we move on to the next agenda item? Do I motion that, or am I free to just say?
No, if you could just again announce the agenda item to make sure everyone is following along, and then we will go to the presentation.
Thank you. So the next agenda item is the discussion of handling of complaints received by the commission.
Before we proceed to the PowerPoint presentation, I'd like to report out that staff received one letter of correspondence providing comment on the matter. On item 4, the correspondence was distributed to the commissioners, posted online, and made part of the public record. Thank you. And when the chair is ready, I believe we have a public speaker on item number 4. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to open it up for public comments on the agenda item.
Six.
That's what I thought. Okay. Oh, we don't have anybody on item 4. Thank you.
Okay, so the next agenda item is complaints received by the commission. Again, this was something that the commission members asked us to provide further direction. And again, much of what I'll be saying is from the ordinance, but we can also answer questions from you afterwards. All right, so the first one there, you see that the commission can receive community feedback and complaints and refer them for further review as appropriate. I think we've all kind of encountered that already. Feedback from the community could be characterized as complaints. We talked about how to handle them with Amanda. Second, the CPOC cannot investigate individual complaints for the purpose of imposing discipline. This is kind of consistent with what we just talked about in the last section. The commission is not an investigative body. So the commission can't investigate individual complaints for the purpose of imposing discipline. On a bullet point down at the bottom, depending on the nature of the complaint, the commission may not be able to receive a substantive report on the outcome of a specific complaint if it involves a personnel matter. So I think what you see consistent through the last agenda item and this one is that the commission's role is not to be involved in personnel matters. So depending on the nature of the complaint that you receive, you might not get back a report that's in great detail because it might involve a personnel matter. Notwithstanding the foregoing, the commission can request that the independent police auditor look at specific issues and report whether there may be a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. So the key there being the systemic issues. Mr. Max has spoken about that at length previously. So the commission is empowered to ask Mr. Maxey to look at various issues and report back on whether a systemic issue might be at play there and how it might be addressed. We give a little bullet point example here. For example, while the commission cannot investigate a specific incident alleging improper conduct, it can request that the independent police auditor look at whether there is a pattern of similar conduct. The results of that type of broader project could have a wider community impact than a focus on a specific incident. So I think that addresses some of the concerns that have been raised a little bit earlier. Now you can have Mr. MAXEY look and see whether there's a pattern of similar conduct, and indeed that is where the commission might find that they can have a wider community impact. Is this a separate thing? Yeah. All right. There we go.
They scrambled. Michelle was running the shit.
Are there any questions from the commissioners on the agenda item number 4? Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Chair Baez. I've got a hypothetical. Let's say there is an incident and someone is a witness and they come to a commissioner as to relay the complaint. In that instance, how are we protected? Like, are we there like in the chain are we considered a witness at that point for taking in that information, or I don't know, there's a lot of things going on in local news stories. So my concern in taking in certain complaints,
And
how are we safe?
I'm sorry, Commissioner Jones, I think this really goes towards with the commission being advisory and not presiding over criminal investigations or personnel complaints. I think it's really important to share if someone wants to come to you that, if you want police to look into it, you need to go to the police. But where I think, or if you think that, if you've got a complaint against an officer in terms of they engaged in some kind of improper conduct, well, you should make a personnel complaint. But one thing I think that this commission and other commissions like it can play a really good role is to be able to tell the community, here's the phone number, here's the website, here's how you can make your complaint, because they might not know how the city works. But the important thing is to be able to direct them there. So it's not necessarily that there's much to be done by taking in the information yourself. What's really important is getting them to be able to communicate with the right people at the police department who can take things in from a criminal standpoint, can take things in from a personnel standpoint.
And I mean, how am I to reassure a community member that they're safe? There's often people who don't report things because they fear retaliation.
And I think I understand that, and I think that's where I think they just need to know. That's where if they want to make a complaint and see an outcome from the department about an officer that may have engaged in improper conduct, they need to be able to make that to the police department. And that's where you don't have to physically go to the department anymore. You can submit things online. So there's that. And then separately for detectives, I think they can work with folks as well. But again, being able to share with them, this is where the police department is where you need to go. That's, I think, something that's important.
I feel like there's not going to be a resolve to that. Thank you, Javon.
Commissioner Kanaga?
I had two things. First of all, as a follow-up to what Commissioner Jones was saying, I feel like that's an action item to take to Amanda, to take to the police department. Is there a cheat sheet that can be developed, or does one exist that we as commissioners can all have with regards to referrals, rather than to say, go on the website and, you know, you can look it up and figure it out yourself. I feel like that's an action item. But the reason, the first reason why I think it's an important question that Commissioner Jones raised. But the initial reason for me raise my hand is to go back to a question I raised at the last meeting. And maybe this needs to be in writing. That's on the first bullet of the first page of the PowerPoint, which is the phrase "as appropriate," because I really do think that that is going to come back and it's going to be a question. And I think we need clarity on it. And I think we need it in writing. So action item, I would actually like a legal opinion on that part. So, Justin, can you go back to that first of the two cards? And it's the phrasing of take citizen complaints, and then there's more in that sentence, and at the very end it says something as appropriate.
Have them pull it up. I can. I'll just go reverse. I can probably answer that here.
Cool. Yeah. No,
Wasn't it?
it's
No.
further down.
Okay.
It's like,
Tell me when you see it.
keep going. Keep going. Keep going. There you go.
Second. So Commissioner Kanaga, I can actually take, because I wrote the ordinance for this and
Oh,
I can take a
good.
stab at that. So
Good. We have the legislative history right here. Good.
I think there might be instances where it may not, if we were to say just Pasadena Police Department or just detectives or just internal affairs, that might not be everywhere something could go, because, and just to use an example, something could happen with an officer that doesn't work for Pasadena PD, but a member of the community's got a complaint. Well, that needs to go to that department. Somebody might have a complaint about police officers that might go beyond something that might be internal affairs, or detectives, which could even be something that the city's HR department might need to look into. The city manager's department has a city auditor, so that looks into sort of audit type things. We also, there's also independent police auditor. Brian doesn't have sort of independent investigative powers, but just the reality is, it's just depending on the nature of the complaint. It wouldn't be fair to say they all have to go to, all personnel complaints go to Pasadena Police Department Professional Standards Unit Internal Affairs. That wouldn't be fair. So the idea of, depending on the nature of the complaint, it may need to go to one or more different places.
I just don't know why the phrase "as appropriate" is in there.
But it just depends on where it might be appropriate to send it to.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully it will never come up again. Yes. Thank you.
Commissioner Anand?
I think my question is that I would like to see a mechanism that, yeah, we're going to see these complaints, and some of these complaints are going to take some time to have an outcome, if ever, right? But as the commission space, these couple of hours or whatever that we're here and we have a complaint, so Amanda will say that we have 2 letters or whatever, and from the public. But if one of those letters is a complaint, and yes, we all do receive it. Are we allowed to have a mechanism that just acknowledges the letter was a complaint? There's letters that are going to speak on agenda items. I get that, but specific letters that come to the commission that are addressing a complaint. So whatever that complaint is, that we have that. Do we have that space to acknowledge that letter that it was a complaint? And it is being filed. It is being filed filed to whatever department as Commissioner Canalda said. I mean, no. The city says as appropriate, right? Wherever as appropriate is.
Commissioner Anand, I think that's something that there is staff. Amanda obviously can receive and move those things around, and I think that's something that staff can look at, sort of how to share with the commission about what got moved where. If I were to go to,
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the letter comes in and it's a complaint. Joe Bloggs from Northwest is complaining about either an officer or an incident, right? I'm saying in the commission meeting, do we have a space to just acknowledge the letter? I'm not saying read the letter, talk about what happened in the letter, but to acknowledge that we have received Mr. Joe Blogg's letter as a complaint and it's been sent to the, it's been moved forward to the appropriate department. That is what I'm saying.
Yes, I think we could either agendas specific ones or just potentially even every month just have a space for acknowledgement of complaints that have come in.
Yes, that's what I mean. Okay.
Commissioner Argento.
Commissioner Jones asked about how she could be protected, or was she going to be protected? And I didn't hear anything about protection in the response. Now, maybe I missed something. And I'm not sure whether she was asking whether she could automatically become a witness in a case if somebody gives her details of that they saw or something like that. So I'm not sure that her question was answered. At least I didn't get anything addressed to her being protected in some way, which was a significant word that she used, to my mind. I don't know if I'm being clear.
And I think, Commissioner Argento, I think if a commissioner felt a concern if they received a specific complaint from a member of the public, I think that's something that they can share with staff, and the staff can try to figure out the best way to accommodate them given the circumstances. I think I don't know that there's any kind of broad brush that could be guaranteed, but I think with a little bit of understanding about what the specific matter was and what the specific concerns were, I think that's something working with staff, then that could be explored on a case-by-case basis. But I think the other point that I wanted to make to Commissioner Jones, though, is that what's really important is that the commission doesn't have investigatory power, and your best use of sort of your role as a commissioner, in a sense of receiving something, from a member of the public, is really be able to share this is where you move it to, or just if you want to submit something in writing, to the commission, there is an email address for the commission to receive complaints.
I'm going to jump in and thank Commissioner Argento for bringing that back up. I'm sure that everyone sitting in that room is well aware that there's recent documents that are circulating where witnesses' names are not redacted. And so in an instance like that, those witnesses are no longer safe. So why would anyone feel comfortable even coming to this commission to share a complaint, especially if we're only going to redirect them to the possible problem? We're not safe. The community's not safe. And we're not doing anything to change that dynamic. We literally don't have the power to. Our city's leadership has the power to, and they're not. So in this instance where someone may come to us and have a complaint because they witnessed something or something occurred and affected them directly, we're redirecting them to report to the police what the police did. I don't think it's best for them to investigate themselves. So it becomes a safety matter for everybody involved.
I want to echo, and maybe I want to echo what Commissioner Jones is saying, because there's a different dynamic with maybe me and her and some others, is that community members may come to us on, and I'm gonna say on the GP, which is just, you know what I mean? Like, they know us, they understand where it stops with us, and they're gonna say something, and we're gonna hear it, and 9 times out of 10, you know, we're gonna be able to say, you know what, hold that thought. I don't know what you're supposed to do with that right now, but just hold that thought, hold that anger, hold that emotion, because when 9 times out of 10, we're probably not going to lead it to the police, because it's a bit of a tricky road down there. And then I think a little bit of what Commissioner Jones said, that due to circumstances that just happened, it makes it a little bit even more uncomfortable for the community. So I think I get what you're saying, Jovan. In the white systems, it would be really easy to be able to say, hey, everybody, yes, you had a complaint. Look, let me give you the website for the city, or let me give you the phone number for the police, and hey, give them a call. Let them know what happened. That's a very white system, and I get that, and it does happen in certain cases. But in our world, that doesn't happen, right? And so, because 9 times out of 10 it's taking them down a rabbit hole that is probably going to be uncomfortable for them and their family. And so I think what Commissioner Jones is saying is that, as in this space, in hearing any form of communication, right? How do we refer and ensure that, as us as the middle persons or the mediators or whatever that's going on, that information will stay solid. And when we say solid, that means it stays protected, it stays safe. That, you know, if you go here, it's going to be okay, it's going to be solid, it's going to be safe. There's no blowback on you, there's no blowback on your family. It's good. That is a response that probably none of you can give, right? Because of the way the system's worked out, and I get it. And so I say all this is, and maybe really to answer Commissioner Jones is that we kind of have to keep it the way it is and let the system do what it does, and we do what we do on our community levels, and but ensure that emotions, anger, and proper truth is going out, right? But where I kind of end on saying is that as a commission in a system, and a white system, is that we have to ensure that the space for a complaint is validated, is heard, right? But then it's up to you guys to do the protection, right? Whatever level that is, not you in that room, but whatever level that moves on to. But our role, or I can say I see our role, and my role in the commission, is to be able to validate a complaint which has never been validated before, voice a complaint which has never been done before, said that it's going to be sent to an appropriate place for a long journey somewhere else that's never been done before, but also a place to check back in and say, Mr. Maxey or city staff, where is this complaint along the justice journey? Are we still in the pig pen, or have we actually come to an outcome? I think that's the place for us, and or I can say for myself, that honors my community and honors us. And I hope maybe that kind of answers it a little bit for Commissioner Jones, and maybe Javon, you can, or anybody in the room can answer back. But I don't think that you guys can truly answer the protection question to me or Ms. Jones or any of us in the instances that I'm talking about. That's what I'm saying.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Commissioner Kanaga, you're muted.
Sorry about that. We could and should talk at length. I think it should be a separate agenda item. We need to talk about the fear of retaliation. And we need to talk about what other, and this is a policy question too. So maybe this is something that we can also speak with Brian about. I was involved in a case many years ago involving when I was representing the city, not disclosing any attorney-client privileges, but it did involve a murder, a killing, and it was not investigated. It was rejected by the DA's office in the county where it occurred because the accused city officer used to work for the police department that investigated it. Ultimately, the alternative was it was investigated by the AG's office, and the case ended up being filed as first-degree murder, and the person is in for life. My point is that there are some legal alternatives, and that is something that we as a body need to look at, is the fear of retaliation. To go back to a question that His Honor Commissioner Argento had raised with regards to protection, that's a question I think we also need to be able to answer as commissioners. What role, what responsibilities do we have when a member of the public does approach us with information? Is it that we have a responsibility because that person is talking to us as a commissioner to turn over? It would be considered evidence. I'm wearing my former hat as a prosecutor. It could arguably be evidence if the person ends up disclosing information, or in the context of wearing our hat as a commissioner, being aware of the fear of retaliation, we should just at that point say, before you go further, this is what I need to tell you. These are critical issues for us to figure out.
Commissioner Abernathy?
And I agree with that. And I also think the earlier comment, particularly what Commissioner Anand was saying, it's almost like a complaint tracker that we need to track complaints. We know they come in, but tracking them and what that might involve and what are the possibilities. That seems like that's what I'm hearing too in what she's.
And Commissioner Abernathy, I think the challenge with that is particularly if they are complaints that are things that need to get looked into in a criminal sense, then there really isn't going to be much of a feedback loop to the commission there. And if they're personnel complaints, if they're not of the nature of things that are subject to the transparency laws, then again, they would remain confidential police officer personnel records. So I think it's something that I'm doubtful there would be any kind of a meaningful sort of guaranteed feedback loop per se on what the commission gets, particularly just because of the types of systems they would go into, either police personnel or criminal.
I do understand it goes that direction, but there also could be some things that go forward that actually provide some implications for policies and procedures, right? Which we
sure.
should.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. So if it goes in those two buckets, no, but there are other buckets, yes.
Then yes, and I guess to that, then that's what I would say. That's as appropriate. So.
Do commissioners have any other questions or comments on the agenda item in question?
I would in somewhere agendize in future, and I think Commissioner Abernathy made it a lot clearer to have some form of tracking, that was the right word, system that us as commissioners can, and whatever that looks like, if Amanda has to help us to flush that out, of what that looks like of having a complaint tracking system.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Yeah, I also think that we need to agendize an item that drills down on the two questions I raised, which are number one, our duties as commissioners when and I think this will happen, or I think the situation that is dicier is when it happens between meetings. You know, we're on the street or we're texted. And then the second question of how to, and they're related, how to deal with the fear of retaliation.
Commissioner, Vice Chair Serrano.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, what this calls up for me is what are the legal differences between someone complaining to us, a member of the public complaining to us about something, and what is considered a formal complaint that needs to be investigated. I would love to have some more information about the differences between the two, because I think that will very much help guide our next conversation that time comes to pass.
Commissioner Emmerich Ford.
Yeah, just looking at the agenda, the idea, how are we going to take complaints? So other commissions have online forms where complaints can be made through the commission. Is that something we'll work through, Chair, with Amanda? And what kind of process is set up? Could there be several processes for that information? And some of that sounds like several commissioners have mentioned just information coming to them directly, right? Not being and if information comes through this online portal that I've seen from other commissions, is that something that's discussed in our commission meetings? Is it something that just Amanda handles? I'm just thinking through the logistic of how we would want to do that.
So staff, just to clarify, do we have to formally, does something have to be said in order for an agenda item to be put on the next meeting, or is that something that the staff is actively writing down? And we'll get back to the commission at a later time. I'm just confused as to how that works.
Sure, that's a great question. I think in terms of agenda items, Chair, you have the authority to put items on the agenda. So staff is obviously taking notes and making notes of all of this, and we can have further discussions about the timeline of when these things should be back on, because it seems like some of them need to be fleshed out a little bit more with some more context from staff and legal counsel. I'll also make note, jumping ahead a bit, thinking about next meetings and other items that need to be on an agenda. A work plan is part of your ordinance to have a work plan and priority setting. So these might be bigger picture things for the first 6 months of the commission's life to really implement a tracking system and other things that are coming up here today. So I think these are good foundational conversations that we can then build on as we continue to meet.
Thank you.
I also, Chairman, in fairness, I also wanted to bring up something that was said earlier by one of the staff that said that we could move into, when we want to get deeper in subjects, into ad hoc committees. And if I'm so right that he said it could be, 2 or 3 of us, but ad hoc committees means that we can also add community. Am I right or am I wrong, city staff?
Commissioner Anand, you're correct. But I think just the important thing is that this would be something that the chair would establish a point and make clear sort of whatever the group might be. There definitely can be community members, but the idea is that these groups would only last for specific tasks for a limited duration, and just sort of the suggestion would be no more than 2 or 3 commissioners, just so you don't get anywhere near to the 6.
Right. So what I'm saying is that yes, you can have an ad hoc committee that is just created for a task, 2 or 3 or 4 months or something, to come and report back. But out of those 2 or 3 commissioners, the ad hoc committee can add community members to enrich the ad hoc committee as well for that task.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other action items the commission would like to formalize before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay. We would now move on to the next agenda item, which is the consideration of further training opportunities for commission and direction to staff to begin process of securing specific training.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just give a really brief verbal presentation. You all should have seen the staff report in your packet. It's come up via the commission and community members, an interest in having the commission do further training. As you all know, you participated in 30 hours of training and a ride along. That was part of the establishment of this commission and a requirement, Commissioner. But that is not to say that there could not be further trainings. So what staff is asking for is to just for the commission to engage in a dialogue about what other further trainings they would be interested in. So staff could then go back and research the feasibility and bring back to you some training opportunities that we could hopefully get to further the goals of the commission. With that, Chair, I turn it over to you for questions and discussion.
Does the commission have Commissioner Abernathy?
Thank you, Chair Banez. I think these areas are important domains. Now, some of us, because of our background, may already, have expertise or, past experience training in these areas. But I do think, on the other hand, if we were going to have training that was police focused or, particular focus, that that could be really helpful. And I just wondered, the understanding of Pasadena's history, or the focus on our rich immigrant history, that is very important. But I think the Black history, the Black presence in Pasadena, historical presence, I think that would be very important to be highlighted, and the changes that have occurred over time. Because even in only my 23 years here, there have been significant changes that do affect police and community dynamics. So I would just add that to that history as being very important.
Commissioner Argento?
Yes, I have a recollection from the last meeting that there's some mandatory training that's required by the state. I'd like to be updated. Well, am I correct in that? We have to undergo some ethical training that's mandated by the state for all people who serve on municipal boards. That's what I'm remembering. I hope I'm correct, but I'm not. I'm happy to learn. I would support the idea of learning more about Black history in Pasadena. I would like to hear from somebody very professionally knowledgeable about this, so we get an accurate record, an accurate presentation of what it's about. Then the other thing I'm interested in terms of training, it might be a good idea to hear from the lawyers, the civil lawyers who specialize in police abuse practices. There are a number of them out there in the LA area. There's an association. They may have some ideas about how to protect people who fear retaliation. I don't know that for sure. I'm just speculating about that, but they might be a good group to hear from in terms of how these cases look from people who are prosecuting police officers. That information could help us to say, well, we need to do this because nobody's doing it, or we need to recommend X, Y, and Z because nobody's doing it, or we don't need to worry about that because the civil bar will handle certain kinds of cases to deal with this situation.
Vice Chair Serrano?
Thank you, Chair. I would echo the sentiment of Commissioner Abernathy that there would be great value in the Commission receiving some specific training related to stakeholders in our community and their rich history in our community and their relationship to law enforcement over time. I feel like that would better help us and set the tone for the work ahead of us as a body. I just want to note that in the staff report, there's reference to cultural sensitivity, which I do think that is, in some regards, an appropriate term, but I would invite us to maybe consider something more that looks like or sounds like multicultural humility, and how that connects to issues like implicit bias and microaggressions, what roles those things have in not only how we will perform as commissioners, but also how the police engages in their work as well. And then finally, I would just like to note that in terms of best practices in civilian oversight and an opportunity for all of us to learn more about the other bodies of oversight that exist across the nation, because we are now one of many who are engaging in this work, that there is a association called NACOL, the National Association of Civilian Oversight and Law Enforcement, NACOL. I know that Brian is a member. They actually have a national conference that is happening next month. And there is an in-person component. There's also a virtual component, but it feels really appropriate that we send some representation of this commission to participate in that conference, so that we not only, take great opportunity to learn from the workshop that are presented and the variety of speakers, but to also network and build relationship with other law enforcement agency representatives that show up to that conference, as well as other civilian oversight commissioners and IPAs that I know are present. I will say that in my years of working this, I have been able to attend a conference and have attended several workshops from NACOL. I have found them incredibly valuable. And so my hope is that the city would support the commission in its participation in this upcoming conference. And I mean that financially and with also its blessing, so to speak, because I think it is important that we have that presence. I think Brian is going for us to join him in that work, send a good delegation from Pasadena to this learning opportunity is something that I would really like for the city to explore for us and be able to give us more information about how we might register and participate. Again, as a body, I know that we can't send even 11, and I'm sure it wouldn't work with any other tools or so, but let us figure out how we can have some representation at that.
Vice Chair, I'd suggest, since this is a financial item, we would have to investigate and potentially take that to council to arrange a budget, a formal vote to see if this is the consensus of the commission to make that ask.
I would support this if it is the will of the body to ask that the council make a decision on that financial support of our conference. If that needs to be a motion, I'm happy for that to be a motion.
I second.
Yeah, I second and also validate, Juliana, that I've been to NACO conferences, and we've both been to one-day conferences, and they are an instrument of just pure research and resources, and I think it would be valuable to those that can go in December to go, because NACO is you're going to see the municipalities from all over the country that are doing oversight. You're going to hear what went wrong, what could have been better, and what is absolutely excellent, and then also just great dialogues from the stage, and then as Juliana said, people that are there that you can have sideline conversations and learn from and create relationships. So I truly think that it is a good foundation to those who are really building in this work.
Seems like we have a motion and a second. So Chair, if you'd like to call for a roll call.
There's other commissioners wanting to speak, but
do that first. Okay. Unless the other commissioners would like to speak before we go to the vote.
Commissioners, would you like to speak first?
Yeah, I had a comment, but it is not relevant. It's not on point with the pending motion.
Well, Commissioner Levy, would you like to speak before we take a vote?
No, I just had a simple request. If Mr. Maxey, Brian, if you could send that core reading list that you sent out early in our training. I've just been searching everywhere for it and I can't locate it.
Okay. I would like to call a roll call for a vote.
Yes, the motion was made by Vice Chair Serrano, seconded by Commissioner Abernathy. Commissioner Abernathy.
Yes.
Commissioner Nong.
Yes.
Commissioner Argento.
Yes.
Commissioner Emmerich Ford.
Yes.
Commissioner Jones.
Yes.
Commissioner Kanaga.
Yes.
Commissioner Lurvy.
Yes.
Commissioner Matthews.
Yes.
Commissioner Stacy.
Yes.
Vice Chair Serrano,
Yes.
Chair Ibanez.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Yes, I just had a couple of points on the pros training, that there be inclusion of a little bit broader, or also include challenges for people with disabilities and tolerance and inclusion along those lines. Okay, because as we know, so many of the folks that that really need a lot of assistance and support have different kinds of disabilities and mental challenges. And then the other thing is with regards to the history of Pasadena, in particular, the Black history, that it also include the education component and the segregation and how that has impacted Pasadena today.
Commissioner Nam?
What I do want to reiterate, which was coming through all of our letters when we were pushing for the commission, was trauma-informed training. I think that is critical to all of us, and that trauma-informed training. And then also I want to highlight to the fact that, and maybe it's a question also for Javon, is that in these trainings that we do, is there a component that in all of the trainings, whichever ones that get decided, is there a component that we could simultaneously have these trainings and a section of the police department be a part of that training too? So, and that's just a question. You don't have to answer it, but that's one. Trauma is very important to me. Trauma informed is very important, and also is that in any of our trainings we do have local stakeholders, as Juliana said, that we are trained by people who are from our community, and the cultural sensitivity is the key. Yes, we definitely have a rich history of the Black presence, but as if we're talking about the history, it then goes into so many other levels of immigrant history, and we have to talk about that as well. So I just want to be put on record that yes, I'm very much for trauma-informed training, and I'm very much for the cultural sensitivity, but I'm also very much, the last training is the history of gangs in our Pasadena. And I think that is also very critical to learning the not just where it started 20, 30 years ago, which some people might think, oh yeah, it started, Navarro and Howard. Gangs in Pasadena has a very, very, very rich, and is even tied in with our Black presence here. And so I think that it should be noted for the record that training for the gang history, Black and Brown, is very critical to our commission as well, to be given to us by local stakeholders. Thank you.
Ryan?
As I was talking with Chair Ibanez and Vice Chair Serrano, one of the things that we started talking about was that as you develop a training that may not exist in the city of Pasadena in any coherent form, And exactly to Commissioner Anang's point is that there's value in creating this not just for yourselves, but something that could be packaged and delivered to the police department, so that they're included in understanding the history of Pasadena. If there's a racial reconciliation part to that, maybe built into the training, cultural awareness, whatever you assign value to learning, figuring out ways of redistributing that to the police department. And it may be inviting them in, as Commissioner Anang said, to the training itself, and you'll get a certain group of, maybe you can even bring in the trainers to better understand this and pass it along. But there's also an opportunity that's happened in other jurisdictions. I have no idea if the city will back this financially, but to create almost like micro grants to community groups to build trainings to present out to the police department. In other words, you get a representative group or combined representative groups, and they say, this is what we need the police to know about our culture, about how we are going to respond, how we feel about police presence, whatever it is they want to know. You hear it directly from the community rather than outside trainers attempting to distill that. So I'm just throwing that out for consideration to this group.
I would also like to see training on the school to prison pipeline, specifically in regards to formerly incarcerated and system impacted students, preferably from organizations with longevity and or organizations that reside within the city of Pasadena. Are there any other action items the commission would like to bring forward before we move on?
I wanted to quickly ask the question what Brian said about, like you said, it's a big picture thing about the grants or whatever, and community groups being able to be, the presenters. And I don't know if you know the answer, but how long is that process? You know what I'm saying? Like, just say if we was to nail it down to February, March, is that a long process? If we was to try and put that, you know what I mean? Like, there's a part where I'm like, yeah, that sounds good, but does that mean that we would have to wait another 6 months before that could be implemented? I think those might that's from what you just said.
So what I'm hearing is there's an urgency to get the training for this group primarily, and that you don't want to hold it up for opportunities to expand it necessarily. I would guess you could do both, because whoever develops this training will develop the training and they can present it to this group. And if you are pleased with it and you think it's of value, then you could talk about ways of delivering it to the police department. In training in police departments generally, and I have not talked to this department about it, typically they have online or roll call trainings. I guess they call them turnout trainings here, where they're short snippets, 15-minute presentations of information, and then they have longer pieces of information that they build into in-service training. In modern policing, those training hours are increasing and increasing and increasing. So finding the right length and making sure what you want to deliver, I think will be important. So to answer your question, Commissioner Nong, I don't think you need to wait for it, but as you're going through it, you can think about it and plan it.
Okay, so it's 2 lanes. The 2 lanes can coexist. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Argento?
I have a recollection of hearing introduced someone on the Pasadena Police Department who was working on these issues of cultural sensitivity. to create a training component or to modify a training component that already exists. I can't remember more detail than that, but I'd certainly like the staff person to inquire about that so we have a chance to, we could ask that person to come over and brief us on where they're at in that process.
Commissioner Stacy?
Hi, Commissioner, excuse me, Commissioner Argento brought up a point that I was just thinking of. If any of these types of training that we've been speaking about are already contained possibly in the police department training, especially online versions, that might be worth our looking at and taking that training, or at least finding out what they are using.
Commissioner Abernathy?
Thank you, Chair Banez. I know last month's meeting was different, but kind of following up with the question that Commissioner Argento noted, yes, there was that mention of ethics training. Will there typically be minutes from our meeting? Because I see the FAQ, which does cover, last month was different. But will, like all of these topics, I'm making some mental notes of them, but I'm also looking up stuff online as it's being talked about, right? So will we have a list of, you know, well, will there be minutes? Will there be minutes from typical minutes from this meeting that might list these kinds of things we're talking right now?
Yes, there will be minutes. Because of the short turnaround, we did not have the minutes ready from the last week's meeting, but going forward, we'll have minutes every meeting. The minutes will be action minutes, so it won't delve into every detail of conversation. But of course, the recording is here, and staff will use that in accompanying staff reports to get more into the details of these kind of topics to make sure we're encompassing all of them and listing them all for your further consideration.
Okay, great. So I would just make the request that these topics be listed in our minutes. Could that be possible? Because this is very important.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And I totally understand. This was a quick turnaround. I understand. Thank you.
Commissioner Anand?
Yeah, I respectfully kind of hear the training that Mr. Argento and Commissioner Stacy was saying, hear from the police. And I think both sides, it would be good. But let me say me. When I'm talking about cultural sensitivity, I think we have, all our training components have to be learned from the community. Like, we got the 30 hours from the police, and that was good, that was excellent. But we have an opportunity to get trainers and stakeholders from our community to speak about trauma, to speak about history, to speak about gangs, to speak about all these things that we've said, prison to pipeline, that can speak to us and the police. And I think I want it to be noted in the record that that's where my focus is in, is that we have the opportunity to be taught by our community, because cultural sensitivity cannot be taught to us by the police, and no one's going to hear us listening to a training about cultural sensitivity from the police. I mean, that's the moment where probably my camera would go off, and I mean, I'm just going to keep it 100. That's not what I'm about, right? I want to hear cultural sensitivity from my Asians, my Hispanic, my Blacks. I want to hear it from the LGBT. I want to hear it from all of those. I want to hear it from the homeless. That's where I want to hear it, from the ones, the suffering, the marginalized, and the ones whose voices we don't get to hear. That's the trainings. That's the voices of trainings that we really need to hear. That's the elephant in the room for me, right? And I'm going to keep saying it, it's for me. The police trainings are good, but if as individual, as commissioners, to get online and to listen to them, 100% power to you. But in this space, we have the opportunity to have stakeholders whose voices have been so marginalized in our community that they don't get a voice to get in this space, that we can really hear those voices. So what is it feel like to hear from the deaf person who's always been harassed to move on from loitering because they don't hear the officer saying, move, but they don't hear. You know what I'm saying? We get to hear from the, the training from the LGBT, from the homeless, from the young Black and brown people in our community. That's and the trauma that has been inflicted for generations into this community for our Black and brown and marginalized people in this community. Those voices are the trainings that we need to hear. No disrespect to nobody, but I'm not about to co-sign on as yet listening to cultural sensitivity from the police. I feel that cultural sensitivity needs to come from stakeholders from our community, that the police should be in that room and being as uncomfortable as the rest of us, and we can all learn something together. And it's all said respectfully. Thank you.
Commissioner Stacy.
Commissioner Anon, your points are well taken. My point was, if we view what the police department is looking at, then we will know what they are looking at so that we can enhance upon it and we can make recommendations for changes. It was not to substitute for community involvement. It was to make sure that we understood where their training begins and ends so that we can make appropriate changes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Argento. Commissioner, you're muted.
Commissioner Argento, you're muted.
Now I got to remember. One of the things that we can ask if we get the fellow who's working on the cultural sensitivity for police training is, do they include an element in their training where they have people from the community, like Commissioner Nong is describing, engaging with them, so they're hearing from people who are most directly affected by this historically and at present. So I don't think the two concepts are inconsistent, because we want to find out what they're doing, and we want to find out from Brian what our best practices that are, at least what are thought of as best practices in terms of police training for cultural sensitivity, so we can make sure, or at least do our part to make sure, that Pasadena's process includes those elements. Okay, that's it.
Do any commissioners have any other input before we move forward?
Chair Banyas, before you proceed to the next agenda item, I'd like to report that the City Attorney's Office received one letter of correspondence referencing item 5, which is asking for strong support and training for both the Commission and Police Department. The correspondence was distributed to the commissioners, posted online, and made part of the public record. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we will proceed to agenda item 6, which is a presentation by Brian MAXEY, Independent Police Auditor, regarding best practices in law enforcement policy review and discussion of Commission's process for recommending policy changes.
Chair Banyas, you also have one public speaker waiting to speak on the matter. Thank you.
I will now open it up for public comments on the agenda item in question.
Adriana, you've been invited into the Zoom meeting. Can you hear us?
Hi, yes, I can hear you.
Great, thank you. You have 3 minutes to speak on the item. Your time starts now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, in last week's meeting, Brian MAXEY said he is working backwards from use of force incidents and internal affairs files. I'd also like to remind the commissioners MAXEY is a certified police officer in Seattle and has served as defense for police departments. He was chosen by City Council as the independent police auditor very rapidly without an open process. City Council said they would approve him with a clause in his contract that the commission can reappoint an independent police auditor if they are not satisfied with his services or do not believe him to be truly independent. The commission should be in close relation to the independent police auditor, making that person reliable and trustworthy to carry out truly independent audits and investigations. The commissioners can use as recommendations to City Council and the City Manager office in regards to PPD policies. MAXEY, you do not, in regards to your statements about working backwards, I just want to underline that you do not need to reinvent the entire wheel. Please make use of already existing independent reports by Janaco's Office of Independent Review, which includes recommendations that were never implemented by PPD. And then also on Thursday's emergency meeting at Jackie Robinson, Deputy Chief Cheryl Moody admitted that PPD uses traffic stops as an entryway into drivers' vehicles to search for guns. PPD's insatiable search for guns puts Black and brown residents at danger and is especially predatory and even deadly practice in Northwest Pasadena.
You have 1 minute left.
Something that I would like to see the independent auditor look into is PPD's known connection to illegal sales of firearms. Guns sold by Lieutenant Vaskin Gordikian. In 2009, he was reported to sell 108 guns. And the Pasadena Star News wrote that Chief Sanchez was pressured into retiring shortly after Gordikian was indicted. Emails uncovered revealed that the chief's wife consulted with Gordikian about buying rifles a month before the raid. Sanchez wrote Gordikian several waivers, a common practice in police departments that allowed him to skip the 10-day waiting period. At least one of those guns was immediately flipped. And I think it's also
Adriana, your time is up. If you can please conclude your comments, please.
Okay, and I think it's important that MAXEY also review the corruption scandals such as this in relation to PPD in his investigations, and just recognize what the patterns are, especially since this was a lieutenant and a high-ranking officer. So residents do have a feeling that this was not the end of it.
We know it wasn't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes public comment on the item. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will now proceed to the agenda item.
So, good evening, commissioners. I'm going to attempt to be sort of mercifully brief in this area, but really what I'm trying to elicit here is two things. One is, as the public commenter just referenced, my intent is to read IA cases, read use of force cases. I will certainly look at prior reports. I will certainly look at prior reviews. And in fact, I've just received a 2017 report by the National Police Foundation and some updates that were made to the Pasadena Police Department's use of force policy in 2017 in response to that. The Pasadena Police Department uses Lexipol, which is a private for-profit company that helps police departments to make changes as legal updates are passed, either at the state, federal, local level, to keep the policies in accordance with the law. What Lexipol does not do, and they do not purport to do, is to ensure or examine a policy to see whether it is forward-leaning, whether it is in alignment with the community, whether it is so-called progressive police policy, that falls to police departments to modify, to update, to think about how they want to position policies. And in national discussions on policing policy, I think it's well accepted that setting your policy at the constitutional floor or at the bare minimum of legal requirements is really not where any department should be in giving guidance to its officer. You really need to elevate it up and create a buffer so that they're not close to violating anyone's rights, or and they have clarity as to how the department wants them to proceed both legally and in terms of the values of the department. So there's a lot to look at in policies. In looking at the bias complaints and the IA processes and the use of force cases and reviews, I'm anticipating there will be things that will jump out and they will be in accordance with prior reports in this area that I can bring to your attention. This is what I'm seeing. I will put out the one caveat, though, that the first 6 months they had 19 reported categorical uses of force. It's not a huge sample. As time goes on, that sample will build and we'll begin to see more patterns over time. This does not mean to say that this working backwards is the only process. There's two other processes. One is general policy reviews. There are a few that I think are probably going to be front and center. Really comes down to investigative stops, so-called Terry stops, how the department policy is around that, the use of force policies, how and review policies are aligned. And really, from an encounter, from the initial contact into an arrest, how do these policies align? That will likely be the starting point of what I will look at, just to familiarize myself with department policy and to look for room for improvement. That being said, the ordinance that created this body is very clear that policy is something that you can and should look at and try to recommend improvements and advise the department on your perspectives and the community perspectives on those policies. So to that end, I do need to know what your priorities are. And we don't have a mechanism. I mean, as others have commented, it's difficult to sit down and talk these things out thoroughly in advance to understand, what everyone's priorities are. This is the open public forum to do that. But what I would need to know is, which of the policies do you want to task me to review? Which do you want some background information so that you yourselves can delve into that? If there's research you need in certain areas, this is where you give me guidance as to what it is you want me to look at, and I'm open to that completely, even as I do my own auditing work and then present to you what I'm finding through my own initiatives. So that's what I'm trying to bring before this group is, what is the process by which you want to decide that? And then, I know this body's waited a long time to get up and running, and there's a sort of what I would call a bias for action here. Let's get things done. And I respect that. I would caution that you can't change everything at once. If you pick 1, 2, 3 policies, that will take time to research and present and to consider. We can't go through the entire policy manual at one sweep, but I am ears wide open to what your priorities are and how you want me to proceed.
Commissioner Abernathy?
Thank you, Chair Banyas. Well, one of the things that could be helpful, just building up, Mr. Maxey, on what, building out from what the comment that was just made, there have been past discussions, reports of what Pasadena Police Department would need to do, or the policies of concern. I can almost imagine this is a PowerPoint. This is not a detailed background on all those parts, but just to lay that out. So that's an example of history.
the history of policies that have already been identified. And normally in this kind of case, because there hasn't been a civilian police oversight, these are the things that have had the greatest impact, you know, or have raised the greatest concern. So I would like to just have that laid out visually, if you will, so that we can see and know that. That is one of the first things that comes to mind for me. Is that something you could provide?
Let me just make sure I understand what it is that you're suggesting. What I'm hearing is there have been past reports, whether from Mike Giannacco or others, reviewing incidents, and recommendations were likely made in those reports to present to this commission a listing of past recommendations, and I would guess whether or not they've been implemented, and if so, to what degree. Is that sort of what you're looking for?
Exactly, exactly. That's right.
I see no reason why I could not provide that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Nov?
I think I'm probably going to piggyback, but maybe left field on what Commissioner Abernathy just said, because as the last commentator just said, that there has been some very intensive reports from the OIR group, you know, from Kendrick McDade to J.R. Thomas, and I think, and then also I believe the city commissioned them for Anthony McLean as well. But what I would be interested, maybe I'm saying the same thing as Ms. Abernathy is for, I would like to go, and maybe this is just me, from the death of Corey Barnes, from that police shooting till now, I would be interested in, and I think, I can't remember if OIR group did Corey Barnes. Anyway, if how the recommendations have looked that have been presented to City Council, and like you say, recommendations to whether the police department implemented them, you know, took them to course, and were they ever implemented them into their system? And it would be, and I think going back a couple of 2 or 3 deaths is not enough. I think actually going back maybe to Corey Barnes, which is probably equaling us to maybe 10, from there would be very, very interesting for me if that is something that's in your capability to do. That every single report that came out from Corey Barnes of a death related is how was the recommendation implemented into our PD, and if it was. Because I think that will tell a story, right, that we all need to hear. Both sides need to hear. And it's not a story of they've done wrong or they, I think it'll be a very, very valuable tool, even as we move forward to trying to recommend policies for the police. Because if we look at recommendations that have come from very established places and lawyer firms and everything that have been documented, which the city has paid buku money for, taxpayers' money, that those recommendations are still sitting in a desk somewhere and have not moved on, then what does it say to our recommendations to the PD? If they weren't adhered to, then what's ours? But so for us not to have that argument, let's bring history back and let's all learn. And now we can all come together as commissioners and say, okay, this is really what we're working with. Thank you.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Yeah, I agree with the commissioners Anand and Abernathy. I do think this would be really critical. I would also want the report, if possible, Mr. Maxey, to include for the recommendations which were not adopted, what was the reasoning? So that we can, right?
I'm so sorry. It wasn't Corey Barnes, it was Leroy Barnes. I'm so sorry. Sorry.
Yeah. So to the extent that we would know what the reasoning is, could inform our next set of recommendations.
Commissioner Kanaga, I fully understand the request, and I honestly, as I sit here, I have no idea how difficult that will be to get to. I think cataloging the recommendations will not take long, matching it up with what changes have happened since then and whether these have been addressed. I don't anticipate that would be that hard, but getting to the reasoning why, especially with events that, well, certainly fresh in the community, you know, I believe the Leroy Barnes, the report at least, and I don't know the date of the shooting, but the date of the report was in 2009. So there may be some history that I've got to dig into. I don't know how accessible that will be.
Yeah.
But
no,
I
I appreciate, you might not find the answers, but it would be great if it's recorded somewhere.
Vice Chair Serrano?
Thank you, Chair. Brian, you mentioned earlier our use of Lexipol, and I know that we are one of the many police agencies in the state of California that utilizes Lexipol. In fact, I think Lexipol is used by the majority of law enforcement agencies in our state. It's probably something like 90% of agencies utilize it for, as what you said, you know, that baseline policy. Oftentimes, police departments aren't taking the opportunity to truly expand and build upon what the state and the Constitution is requiring of the department and really making it its own. I know this was a problematic thing that came up when AB 392 was implemented. You know, Lexipol was literally training police departments and saying that the law really didn't change that much, don't worry. And so, you know, continue to operate off of your own policy that you have in place. And so what comes up for me in all of that is, you know, what is the process by which the police department is receiving those updates to law and then simultaneously preparing and equipping the police force to now be aware and trained in the new law. What does that rollout look like? Is it just a memo that gets sent to someone or some persons, and that's all that's required of them? I think it's really important for us to know, because the laws are changing and evolving yearly that impact police practice, and for us to be informed and aware of how the department's getting those notifications of the changes in law, and then training the forces accordingly so that they can change their practices to match the legal requirements that are expected of them, so that in particular, as we talk more and more about accountability, we know that that's all in alignment with violation of law and a dependency between that and practice, right? So just curious to know more. There's some investigating you can do for us in that regards.
So, Vice Chair Serrano, I just want to make sure I understand what the ask is. So Lexipol sends out regular updates to all their membership of changes in law that is, for all California departments. When California law changes, they send out the blanket ones. When there's a local legal change, they will give it to the local entity. So there are bulletins that Lexipol puts out to its membership that explains what the changes should be, and they simply say this paragraph needs to be changed to this, and the policy changes is usually adopted by the department. Are you asking for access to those updates, or to be informed of departmental changes to the policies overall, or what? Just want to make sure I understand you.
Sure. No, I appreciate the ask for clarification. What I'm curious to know is, how does that memo then translate to the rank and file and actually changing the way lease according to the changes in law?
Got it. So the policy training connection, and then back into accountability. Copy.
Commissioner report.
Yep, thank you, Chair. I think, Mr. Maxley, the other thing that I was interested in is you're already looking at use of force cases, just kind of case investigations in general on complaints, like issues of unbecoming conduct or issues of harassment. How many of those are sent within a given year? What is their policy for following up on those? Does the police department do public opinion surveys? Have they in the past? What came out of that? What was training that came from the public opinion surveys? Just to better understand that Lexipol would be one way of doing it by following the law, but there's a lot of leeway in, we heard a lot of de-escalation during the police training, right? So what is helping get at some of that de-escalation? So trying to tie some of that in with some of that unbecoming conduct or some of the harassment complaints. So it'd be something I'd be interested in to see if you could find some data for us on that.
Understood. And that sort of goes to the core of a police department being a learning organization, pulling from all possible sources of data, which most departments, it's difficult for them to get there, but I think it's certainly a good goal, and I'll certainly look into that and see what I can, whether I can connect it. I will just say that in terms of reviewing, the internal affairs investigations, what I'm supposed to be doing is looking at bias. And I think I've told this group before that because the department has not identified very many bias complaints, I've actually asked for all complaints to look at intake and classification to see if they're not using that classification, and maybe there's room for improvement there. But as I sit right now, I'm not reviewing all of the internal affairs cases on things like harassment or rudeness or discourtesy or anything of that effect.
So maybe, Chair, I'm not sure what the policy is for this, but maybe it's something for Amanda, but that would be something that would be of interest to myself, that I feel for the commission. Maybe it's something we need to discuss at a further meeting, but having some access to some of that information would be great.
Well, and as sort of as the theme of this portion of the agenda is really to inquire about what the process should be about. I had it framed in terms of requesting, policy research review, what your priorities were in that area. But it goes to all of these requests in terms of the backtracking on the prior reports and the recommendations and were they filled or not filled. That really is sort of an investigation into the development of the use of force policy and how it's played out. Some of these other requests go into training and now into internal affairs. How does this body want to give me work? I mean, I have capacity. I have a limited budget. I'm trying to work within that. I'm trying to be responsive all at the same time, and certainly I'm going to go back to the city if I can't do it under the current agreement. We'll figure out a way we can get it done. But in terms of your priorities and what you want me to do and what you want me to get back to you on, what your priorities are, how does this group want to go about assigning me this work? Do you want to vote on which should come first? Do you want, what structure do you propose?
Maybe I'm a little confused. Yeah, I'm a little confused. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm just confused.
Well, I mean, I just received 3 different assignments, each of which will take a significant portion of time to address, and I'm trying to figure out what do I start with? What's most important to this group?
So, okay, so what you're saying is you've just been given 3 different things to do, and you're asking us to choose out of those 3 things, which is your number 1, number 2, and number 3 priority from what you just heard. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and does the commission want me to do all 3 of those?
I mean, even if what I'm hearing you saying is that even if you want us to do even if we want you to do all 3, you still want us to give you one. What's the top line? What's the really important? The second really important, and the third, right? Because I would say for myself, I'm personally thinking that you're going to do all 3, but I'm thinking your question is saying you want to know which of those 3 is top priority to our whole commission, and which is second and which is third.
That would be very helpful. I just want to make sure that I'm being responsive to what this group wants, and that I'm being as efficient as I can.
Can you repeat those 3 that you're saying, just for me? I just need to hear it again. The 3 that you're saying that we've asked you. I know that the one that me and Abernathy, but I just want to title it down because I thought that Commissioner Kanaga was in ours as well, but if there's something I'm missing.
So and I'll do my best to articulate this properly and reflect it back to you here. The 3 that I've heard is 1, to look at prior investigations into critical events and officer-involved shootings, to see what recommendations were made, to catalog those, to determine whether they were or were not accepted and implemented, and if possible, if they were not implemented, why not? That's sort of assignment number 1. Okay. Assignment number 2 really is, as Lexipol or the department changes policy, how are those changes trained to the department to ensure that officers are responding to those changes in the law? Okay. And then the third one that I heard really comes down to, is the department learning from allegations in internal affairs investigations in areas such as discourtesy or harassment or those things that flag a failure to de-escalate and perhaps to escalate a situation, and whether those are being tied back into the trainings at all so that the department is learning from. That's how I would reflect it back. That's what I heard. If I've got any of them wrong, please let me know.
Okay.
And just to say before anyone starts talking about this, if you would like to and you guys are ready to vote on this tonight, we can absolutely do that. But if you'd prefer to kind of quote unquote sleep on this and think about it as part of the work plan at next meeting's conversation, we can also do that. Because like I said, next meeting, I think we're ready to kind of propose what will be your work plan for the next year. And I think a lot of the conversations from today will be a really good foundational kind of conversations to lead into that. So again, up to you. If you're ready to kind of vote on that, we can, or we can think about that and bring it back to next meeting.
Commissioners, is anyone opposed to voting on this tonight?
I'm not opposed to voting on it tonight, but I would like to see a subcommittee or an ad hoc committee look at these 3 items, and also like, what do we really most want to know that we can affect the policy we think we most want to change, because in other words, to focus on our central purpose. These all relate to the central purposes of this committee, but Brian has got stuff to do, He's got stuff that is discretionary, and we pick the discretionary stuff for him to do. I just want to make sure that we've thought about it as a group and saying, well, yes, this is our number one priority for knowledge, to acquire knowledge of some history, practice, whatever it is, for the next 6 months or whatever it happens to be. In other words, the staff is talking about a work plan. We might need more discussion on what should be going into the work plan and to prioritize them rather than just making a decision tonight. But if the consensus is to make a decision tonight, I'm ready to vote. But sometimes it's better to look at this in terms of the overall purpose of the organization.
I agree with Commissioner Argento.
I agree and I disagree. I understand the work plan, but I understand we meet once a month. That's what I do understand. And I also understand that we have all 4 weeks to do our own research, right? As well. And so I think that I do think that the work plan is going to be fleshed out over time. You know, I kind of think over time, but the base and the foundation of the workplace of what we want to know is in our history. It's in the history of what has happened before, and it doesn't matter to me what ad hoc groups or what or anything to do that, because I think that if Mr. MAXEY, as even one of the community members spoke about, is like if he can give us some real substantial meat to understanding of what has happened before to where we think we would like to go, then at least we'll be able to pivot in we'll have a better understanding of not moving so blindly ahead. But if we choose to wait till the first week of December, if we choose to wait another month and then have another discussion on it and then wait another month to to let him know, then that's like two months. We're gonna get to 3 months before we can let him know what he should start on. That's just me, and I don't think that the first 3 points are that heavy a workload to him. I think all he's asking is, which one should we start to? Which one should we, as a group, consider first that he can start to do some work on? So I would not want to close this meeting and not give him some work to do. That's all. Not give him one piece of work to do. That's all. And not wait till another month to be able to let him know we've now had another discussion to let you know you can start working now.
So, yeah, I think that maybe a vote isn't necessary, but what Commissioner Nong is saying makes sense as well. We need to, if we're going to prioritize a list of things to do, we need to know what's on the list, and it's not going to be just the 3 things that were brought up tonight as first effort to try to identify what the issues are. We need a better, there were other issues that were brought up that are not part of those 3 things, including more specific things like approach to mental health, approach to traffic stops, areas that are more specific as to where Mr. MAXEY look at policies and see what best practices are. And it's true, you can only work on one thing at a time. And so there is efficiency to having that all sequenced, but we're not there yet. We're not even ready to do that yet. Right now, the work is trying to identify the range of issues that need to be prioritized. And I don't feel like the 3 that were mentioned tonight are the full range of issues. In fact, one of the things mentioned tonight is to identify what the issues are. So if we're going to start with anything, we could start with that. And Brian, I think if we could just bring back a list of things that have come up previously or that we know to be hot button issues in areas worth looking at things, then we can suggest other things, but that would be a good place to start.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, it does feel like project number one, prior investigations or recommendations is foundational. It is something that we need. I agree with Commissioner Larby. And then the second one is really a pretty quick question. During my ride along, I was in a roll call and they talked about a new law. So I think number two shouldn't take that much time. And I do think that number three is going to end up being one of my priority areas. But I think from the foundational standpoint, next 30 days, we definitely need the project number one because it's going to inform what we're going to do in terms of prioritizing, or should. So I don't think we should wait either.
Commissioner Argento?
Yes, this is me, but I would want to know first from the from independent investigator IA, MAXEY, is this: do Pasadena use of force policies comply with best practices? I'd like to know that. Then I would be interested in the history that's been described that Commissioner Nang has referred to, what has taken place here and what recommendations. But I'd just like to know if they're up to speed already or they're not, and just looking at existing policies, what needs to be changed immediately, in his opinion, after having reviewed the existing Pasadena policies in light of what are considered best police practices. And while I'm on the subject of best police practices, they may be identified as best police practices, but we don't have to agree that they're best police practices. We may want more information to develop something that we think is a better police practice and draw on the kind of history that Commissioner Anang is calling for. So anyway, that's my question. That's what I would personally like to see looked at first.
Vice Chair Serrano?
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that I feel like we need to remind ourselves of is, that first presentation that we received from our legal counsel regarding the authority that we have. And we do have the authority to also request that the PPD come speak to us on any number of issues. And so what's coming up for me is, how do we use Brian's special investigatory powers as our independent police auditor only in the ways that he can access information for us so that he can deliberate and have a robust conversation around potential policy changes and recommendations, and where do we need more information from the PD, right? And I know to speak personally, when we received part of our 30 hours of training from the PD, that I was left unsatisfied on many occasions by not being able to ask the PD to elaborate or provide more information, right? Because the nature of our training. And so now we're in this forum, in this medium, where we can be asking for additional information. And so I just want for us to hold that in mind. What is information we can get from the PD and chew on? What is information that we need Brian to go get for us so we can chew on? And for me, because of that reality, I feel like we still need a little bit more time to establish what our priorities are and what our work plan is going to look like. I know we're all anxious to get started, and I include myself in that, but I don't want to go so hard that we sort of mess ourselves up along the way and sort of fail to create an opportunity for Brian in particular to engage in work that is still yet unknown to us, because we've got him wrapped up in some things that we were kind of eager and overexcited about in this moment, right? So I know, again, Brian, you've got time and resources, but to a certain extent those are limited. And I want to be able to utilize you in the ways that we most specifically need and want from you.
Commissioner Stacy?
Hi. Thank you, Chair. Brian, this is a question for you. It seems to me that when you're looking at these 19 incidents over the last, the first 6 months of this year, in the process of that, wouldn't you be building a foundation for each one of these 3 questions, just in getting more familiar with the incidents that you're researching already? And would it not be best to keep you focused on that for a short time longer so that we can better develop exactly what it is that we're looking for?
I don't know that they're mutually exclusive. I think there's bandwidth to do both the auditing work and the recommendations that come out of that and dig into the interests of this board. So I don't want to say one should wait on the other. I do want to just say I've been perusing one of the reports just to see the types of recommendations that have been made. And I understand that this is not perceived as a heavy lift, but for example, one recommendation is we recommend that the department formalize its protocols for promoting the cooperation of witnesses while acknowledging the rights, the prevailing circumstances. One option is to use a form and waiver system that clarifies the status of witnesses and their options about traveling to the station to be interviewed. We further recommend that investigators assigned to officer-involved investigations be debriefed on the investigation's purpose and instructed to refrain from using certain interrogative techniques in interviewing potential witnesses to the incident. And that's one of, I think there were 12 similar length recommendations in this one report. So that has 5 or 6 different items in it that actually I can certainly inquire of the department, did you do these things? And they may say yes or no. But really the only way to validate that is to look at other investigations and see whether these, the leading interrogatory techniques have been used in those. So even if the department were to say, yes, we've done that, we've engaged in, the peace method of interviewing that is designed to eliminate, false confessions and, gotten away from the read technique, for example. Even if they were to say that, you'd still need to review them to see whether that occurred in practice. So, I'm not pushing back on this. I'm just trying to highlight that this really does become a rabbit hole as you get down each and every one of these. Could, if this board wants, focus in on what are more strict policy recommendations vis-a-vis use of force, as opposed to some of the officer-involved shooting protocols that really is like, graphing and mapping how this occurred and better, on-scene diagrams, which are some of the others. That may be of less interest to you as opposed to the ones that specifically say, you have a problem with de-escalation, you have a problem with use of force, you have a problem with your approach to this tactically. So I'm just saying, I could list them all and then do my best to triage them into what I think might be most helpful. Happy to follow your lead.
Commissioner Abnati?
Thank you, Chair Ibanez. I do hear the tension about not wanting to get ahead of ourselves. However, the review of these incidents this past year is a way of reviewing what has just happened. That's obvious, we need that. So if we review, and if it's going back to 2009, these other major things, not review them, but just collect. So I would say the first level, not doing this in-depth thing, but just collecting, Mr. Maxey, like you said, those different incidents, and even if you cluster, that's just history. That gives us a sense of just what it's been. So just like we want to know the last 6 months, it makes sense that we want to really know more than the last 6 months because that's important. But then we can still determine in more precision what we're gonna focus on in our next meeting. But I think you've already said that would be doable. That would be doable by our next meeting in addition to the use of force review. And I think that history is just invaluable.
Commissioner Nov?
Yeah, I feel the same way, and I feel that we don't need to go down the rabbit hole in those things. What we can do is create the ad hoc committee meetings, ad hoc committees that can go down the rabbit hole and really come back with some research. Because all you're doing is basically giving us the first layer of the cake, right? And let us build on that. That's all that's necessary to help us to build on that. But I think that if we start to see a pattern or we see something, then we need to go and say, okay, that's not for MAXEY to do. We can now sideline and go dig deeper and find out, and then suddenly find out some gems that have been hidden for years, right? But that's what we're here to do, right? And so I'm not asking you to go down the rabbit hole of did they, should they, you're not going to do all of it. That's not, like you said, you're not, but I think just the surface, first layer of the cake, you can give it to us, like you just said. And then let us take that and now see what sprouts up. We now need to put the cake on. So then when we get to it, we can figure out, okay, from these different, maybe what Mr. Lovey said, there's a mental issue that keeps popping up, or there's a bias thing that keeps popping up. There's a disabled thing that keeps popping up. But those can be found in the research of the ad hocs, right? And we can do those. And they can then come back, report it back to the commission and say, all right, these are findings. And that would have nothing to do with you. You're just the fire starter. That's the best way I could say it. You're the fire starter, and we are going to have to keep that fire burning to purify and get something that comes out like pure gold for the community. Thank you. And to Mr. Argento's thing, I think that even everything that he is asking, all of those are on the tree of the past incidents. All of those are on the tree, and they're just going to fall off, and we're going to start to see it. As he says, it can be even be put on what you just said of, are they doing what they should be doing now? Are they doing what they should be doing now? And if they're not doing it, then, at least we know right now, whatever it is that Commissioner Argento is saying that they're not doing. But even if we know what it is right now, we got to go back to understand why now has never been addressed, even though it could have been addressed so many times back before. They all come together to me.
So commissioners, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like we don't need to take a vote. It sounds like what we're looking for Brian is capable of providing for us next meeting. Is that right? Commissioner Emmerich Ford?
Yeah, I guess I would just like to echo a little bit of what Vice Chair Serrano said and some thoughts of others, that I'm not sure that tonight we've done enough to get at our work plan or priority setting. And so I feel uncomfortable saying, let's start with something when we haven't had an opportunity to really think about what is our commission going to focus on as a priority. Mr. MAXEY's already working on some things as the independent auditor. Well, we'll receive some of that information. So I'm not sure what your question is. It sounded like you were saying, go ahead and move forward with these 3 priorities. And I would just echo that I'm not comfortable with doing that, because I'm not sure that, in my mind, we have not done priority setting and really sat back and thought about what we would like for our work plan to look like.
So I think I should rephrase. Brian, do you feel comfortable with what we need to move forward with for next meeting?
So I'm missing some information, and what I'm missing is how many of these critical events are there. I've gone to the OIR website. There's 2 on there that I've been able to find. I've sent a request to find out how many more might be out there, but I have to assemble them. Then I'm perfectly capable of, sorting the recommendations. I think that would be useful to do. Even for the work that I'm going to be doing, looking at, in order to do the force reviews, just to let you know my process, I have to look at the policy itself, because there's 2 different checks. One is, are they following their own policy? And the second one is, if there's areas in the policy that I think really they should be looking at or need to be expanded, I'll include that in the review, because that's how I'll help form some of the recommendations. So the request to look at the policy, I have to do anyway. The request to look at prior recommendations, I think that would be very, very useful. My concern is, how deeply can I investigate the implementation of those past recommendations? I can certainly see whether it's in the current policy, but there's a lot of nuance there about, like I was trying to, say, if there is a investigator technique or a requirement that they, use certain technology in order to organize their force investigations, or that sort of stuff, I think is probably not what this group needs initially. But I guess what I can commit to is I will do my best to organize this in something that will be useful to this group prior to the next meeting.
Commissioners, do we have any questions in regards to Commissioner Argento?
Yes, I'm not clear whether we're talking about a history that goes back, what I understand to be to 2009, or we're talking about looking at uses of force in regard to the 19 incidents that have occurred in the last 6 months in terms of this initial assignment. Is it one or the other, or both?
Let me see whether I understand the question. I will not have completed the review of all, I don't think, it depends on when I get access to the cases, by our next meeting. I would assume that's more of the December meeting, and then we can get the report and we can talk about it in January. This research that I'm being asked to do, to look into the policy and to look into prior reports, that I can do my best to present that in a useful, presentation to this group for next time. But again, I don't know the scope of that yet, like how many are there? If there's 2 or 3, then that's probably very doable. If there's 10, that can get very complicated.
Do we have any other questions or comments, commissioners?
I think my question is, all right, if we lay this aside, because maybe I'm going with everything, what is it that if you wasn't even doing anything that we just said, and you said, okay, it's too much, what is it that you'll be reporting to us in December? What is it that you would tell us?
Assuming that I get the case access next week as anticipated, then I would review the case files, the interviews, the videos of the 19 categorical uses of force, looking for patterns, potential opportunities to improve policy. If I see training issues, anything that jumps out at me, I would be giving you sort of a systemic report on what I'm seeing in that review. It will have a statistical component to it too, but that's only going to be of so much value because there's only 19 cases. So, it's hard to use percentages on outcomes when you only have 19 cases. But I do my best to organize what I'm seeing and present it to you for consideration.
So I'm going back. So if we don't ask you for nothing, so you may or may be able to give us the 19, depending on whether you access it. But if you don't access it, then you have nothing to give us in December. If you're not able to access whatever it is, the door that lets you into wherever these files are, then you're not going to be able to give us anything in December.
You're saying other than the major research project that I was just assigned? Like if you didn't give me that?
I'm saying if you move aside what you've just been assigned,
yeah,
like the research thing, and forget that, if you don't get into those files, you won't be able to report anything to us.
That's correct. If I don't have access, I can't inform them on it. But I anticipate having access.
So in other words, we can throw the dice of having some information in December, or having a report in December, or having some. If we don't get a report, we could also maybe get a little bit of research, or maybe nothing at all, and then not have you on the agenda, right? If you don't do the research and you just focus on these 19, which is what you were doing, right? If you don't focus on the research and you only focus on the 19, but if you don't get access to the 19, then in December, there'll be nothing to be reporting until you get access. So it could be in January. That's what I'm saying.
I think given the hypothetical you're putting out there, you are absolutely right. If I didn't get access and you didn't give me any work today, I would have really nothing to do and would be completely irrelevant on the December docket, right? I do anticipate that I will have access to those cases and I will get that review underway. I also had anticipated that I would get some homework assignments from you all tonight, which is why we put the policy on the agenda to try to find out what your priorities are and where you wanted me to start. So that's, I think, where we are. I have quite a lot of work based on what I've been asked to do. And my proposal here is that I do the audit work and I dig into the use of force policy and I look at the I believe it's 3 critical events that have had developed reports and do my best to present the outcomes on it and just start with that body of work.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Argento?
Yes, here's what I'm thinking. If we have, to clarify his assignment, he goes ahead and does the use of force for the 19, with an idea of reporting on it at least tentatively in December. But if there's an access problem, I would again suggest that you just look at the existing use of force policies and give us your opinion of whether or not those comply with best police practices as a backup assignment. If the first one, if you run into a problem.
Commissioner Abernathy?
Thank you, Chair Bounds. I think what Mr. Maxey just said, Commissioner Argento, was that he can do all 3. Basically, the report for the use of force is not going to come until January anyway. And then these other 2, he can reasonably do. And it's not going to be this in-depth thing. That's why it's possible. I think that's what I heard. Mr. Maxey, is that what you?
That's a very fair summary.
I can live with that.
Vice Chair Serrano?
Thank you, Chair. I'm comfortable with that path forward, and just will acknowledge that perhaps I'm getting a little stumped with this idea, or the need for us to work on our work plan, right? And so sort of conflating those 2 things, but I think that we can still plan and prepare to have a work plan conversation while having a path forward with Brian in the way that was just described. And then I do just want to note that if our IPA is having issues accessing the information that he needs to do his job, we need to know about that. Because we keep talking about, like, if everything goes accordingly, then we should be, and I'm hopeful that that will be the case, that the police department's being cooperative with Brian's request to access information and other documents. And just to note that that's probably something worth checking in on in December with one another about what that experience was like and how receptive the department is or is not being with our IP.
Brian, I'm hearing that next week you anticipate to have access to these files. If by the end of next week you still do not have access to these files, can you notify the commission?
Absolutely. I mean, my perception so far is that the department has been very accommodating. I made the request to get backgrounded and fingerprinted. They accommodated that on the same day of the request. That's in process. The prints are going off to the FBI, and you know, if they don't come back positively, we have a whole different set of issues, but I suspect they will. I have a Pasadena laptop that's provided for me that will allow me to access into their system. So far so good. And yeah, I'll let you know.
And Mr. Chair, this is Javon. I think probably the best thing would be for, if there were an issue, just Amanda could advise the commission. But what's important is that then the commissioners don't sort of then respond to the email and sort of email amongst themselves, because that could create a Brown Act issue. So again, if there were communication like Amanda's been sending out, I think that's something that really would be best as sort of a one-way, and the commissioners can receive it and give it the weight it deserves.
I see. So then Amanda would be the one notifying us by the end of the week if Brian does not have access?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I will work with Brian to make sure I'm well aware.
Okay, thank you. Does the commission have any other comments or questions before we proceed? Okay, we will now proceed into the next agenda item, which is upcoming agenda items and our next meeting for December 2nd, 2021.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'm just going to say what we talked about. It seems like we have some items that are already obviously coming up in terms of the work plan and having some foundational reports that can help you with that work plan. I think trainings will be part of that too. I think obviously review of policies and Brian's work. So that could be an item that we can give you some background on to prepare, as well as the rules and regulations, which is another part that council needs to approve officially. So we would like the commission's opinion and recommendation on them, which is very much in line with the work plan. So those are two big items, but if there are other items commissioners would like to recommend, whether it's for next month or just to have on the radar, now would be a great time for the chair to take that input.
I think a number of agenda items have been proposed tonight, but they should already be reflected in the minutes. I mean, one of them that I brought up was the role of commissioners when people approach us. Pardon me?
You guys have to mute.
Anyway, I think there were a number of items that were raised during this meeting, of potential agenda items, maybe not for next meeting, but it should be reflected in the minutes anyway, as potential items for future meetings.
Yes, thank you. We'll be sure that everything discussed tonight will get captured both in the minutes and in just our plan and documents for future agenda items.
Commissioner Stacy?
Quick question for Amanda. When are meeting minutes normally available so that we can review them?
They'll be available in the agenda report for the meeting coming up. So when we publish the meeting agenda for the December meeting, you'll have the draft minutes for this meeting and our first special meeting last week. And then you'll have the ability to either approve them or approve them with changes or notes. So then we'll get on a recurring cycle of every meeting, you'll have the minutes from the previous meeting as part of your agenda packet.
Understood. Thank you very much for the clarification.
And staff, just to clarify, this is not the end all be all for agenda items for future meetings. The commission can always contact Amanda and propose or revisit agenda items. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And this can be a recurring agenda item just so at the end of each meeting, if things weren't captured in the meeting and just someone wants to flag something, it's just an opportunity to do that. So completely correct. This is not at all the end all be all.
Thank you. Does the commission have any comments or questions before we proceed? Okay, we will now proceed to adjournment. Unless there's any other comments.
I have a comment.
Yeah, Commissioner Matthews.
Yes, I would like, if possible, for the entire commissioners to receive the copies of Justin's presentation. There was some information in there that I thought was very valuable.
Yes, absolutely, Commissioner. I will, just right after this meeting, I will make sure I send it out to you. It'll also get posted on the commission website for anyone in the public who would like to view it.
Thank you.
With that said, I'd like to thank the commission for their time and the staff for their time. We have officially completed our first meeting. Thank you all. And unless there's any other comments, meeting adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanksgiving, everybody.
Have a